Chapter 704. Young Master, this is a good order. I'll send someone to pass it on right away. Tiger's Mane's eyes lit up, and he remembered this suggestion in his heart. Yang Qindong, who was flattered again, chuckled. But before he could continue to say anything, the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, Su Yunsheng, rode a horse and rushed over from the other side of the street. Although the first city was still under construction, there were rules that cavalries were not allowed to pass through the streets for no reason. However, some people were always exceptions, such as the cavalries who had received military orders and the brothers of the reconnaissance battalion. The soldiers of the reconnaissance battalion were in contact with the front line of the battlefield intelligence. In order to spread the news at the first possible moment, they naturally had some privileges. Su Yunsheng came riding a horse. This originally indicated that something big must have happened. Everyone stood firm and stopped. The guards even faintly formed a semicircle, closely protecting Yang Qindong. This had already become a habit. If any accident happened, they would have to pay at least several times the price to get close to the sixth young master. Who? As soon as the sound came out of Su Yunsheng's mouth, he landed in front of Yang Qindong. After a standard military salute, he said, "Sixth young master, there's an urgent military situation at the front. Inform all the senior officers of the regiments and battalions to have a meeting in the war room." Yang Qindong also became a lot more serious and said with a slightly serious voice, "In the newly built, spacious conference room in the first city, in just half an hour, the main cadres of the 4 regiments in the city were gathered here." Looking from afar, a group of military officers could be seen flashing in and out of their seats. The commander of the Gully Regiment, Tiger's Mane, and the deputy commander, Xian Honghai. The commander of the Nuzhen Cavalry Regiment, Yi La, and the deputy commander, Lu Dai. The commander of the 1st Cavalry Regiment, Zhue Feng. The commander of the 1st Battalion, Deng Yu. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Gao Danhua, and the commander of the 3rd Battalion, Hu Lu. The commander of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, Lu Zhua. The commander of the 1st Battalion, Ma Xiangshan. Commander of the 2nd Battalion, Ding Shan. The commander of the 3rd Battalion, Tai Mu and the others were all present. Yang Qindong presided over the meeting, and the reconnaissance battalion commander Su Yunsheng introduced the enemy situation. Su Yunsheng held a slender wooden stick in his hand, drew a line on a huge map hanging high in the meeting room, and said with a loud voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, the scouts in the front have reported that Agadorji is leading 45,000 cavalrymen to the beginning city. According to our investigation, there are about 20,000 elite cavalrymen and 25,000 ordinary cavalrymen. It is estimated that they will arrive at the West River in the west of the beginning city in 3 days, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow." After introducing the information, Su Yunsheng gave a standard military salute to Yang Qindong and returned to his original seat, waiting for the military order to be issued. After the introduction of the battle report, the discussions of the higher-ranking officers below quickly rang out. It could be seen that everyone's face was filled with excitement. After staying for 50 days, there was finally a battle to be fought. Every one of them was a warmonger. It could be said that their faces were glowing. It seemed that they couldn't wait to appear on the battlefield in the next moment and fight 500 rounds with the enemy. Yang Qindong did not intend to stop everyone from discussing together. On the contrary, he looked at them with interest. He wanted to understand everyone's mentality as soon as possible through observation. To his satisfaction, none of the officers showed any signs of fear or trepidation. The morale of the army could be used. This word popped into Yang Qindong's mind. He knew that even though this battle was going to be tough, it was still a good time for the mercenaries to establish their might. Well, since no one has any objections, then this young master will make the decision. Fight. Does anyone have any questions? No. Sure enough, the voices below were extremely unified. One by one, they opened their mouths and shouted. No one objected. Yang Qindong also stood up and led everyone to the 3-dimensional sand table at the side. After that, Yang Qindong, who was waving the stick in his hand, kept waving it. The north side of the beginning city is the north slope. It is easy to defend and difficult to attack. We can make a fuss about it. The west side of the West River has just had a heavy rain 2 days ago. The river is rising rapidly, which can be used to stop the enemy's frontal attack. We can also make a fuss about it. The south side of the South Forest is suitable for hiding the army. This time, the number of the enemy's cavalry is 3 times more than ours. It is absolutely impossible to fight head-on. Even if we can defeat the enemy, it will be a Pyrrhic victory in the end. This is our first real battle in the grasslands. We must win, not lose. That's why I ask all the officers and soldiers not to underestimate the enemy. We need everyone to be cautious, kill the enemy bravely on the battlefield, and make a name for ourselves. After training for such a long time, it is finally time for us to perform. Now, I order. Swoosh. All the officers above the battalion level straightened their bodies and fixed their eyes on Yang Chendong. Each of them puffed out their chests and expressed their most confident side perfectly. It was as if they were afraid that they would not be able to get the main task if they were not careful. I order. Yang Chendong's mouth kept making sounds. He arranged the military orders one by one. The officers who received the orders nodded their heads. A large net was spread out with the beginning city as the center. Nearly 50,000 cavalrymen under Agadorji came and rode on the vast grassland. Wherever they went, the scattered grassland herdsmen fled. Some of them even had to abandon their sheep pens in order to escape. Along the way, the army had robbed thousands of sheep and horses. Slaughter them all. Pass down the order to make a good meal for the warriors to satisfy their hunger. After we take down the beginning city, I will celebrate with everyone. Agadorji ordered in a tone that was used to win over the people's hearts. Then, he turned to look at Su He and his son, Hilario, and asked, "The vanguard led by General Glenn should be arriving at the beginning city soon, right?" Yes, according to the schedule, he should have arrived at the West River. He should be looking for a tool to cross the river. Su He replied, and his face continued to darken. He was also the only one who was not optimistic about this battle. During the period of the alliance with Walla and Yes Hin, he learned more than once from the other general about their experience with the mercenaries 3 years ago. The more he learned, the more he knew how powerful the mercenaries were. At that time, Walla's troops could be said to have won a great victory. They were all cavalrymen and had an absolute advantage in speed. However, in the face of the mercenaries who were many times smaller than them, they still returned in defeat. Therefore, he did not think that they could take advantage of the advantage of numbers this time. It was just that they really had no way out now. At present, the closest and most suitable enemy was the mercenaries of the first city. If they wanted to get out of the current predicament, they could only fight with them. As for whether they would win or not, they would do their best and leave it to fate. West River? Very good. I hope General Glenn can find a way to cross the river soon. In this way, our army can go straight in and kill our way to the beginning city. By the way, I also heard that there is still a section of the outer wall in the beginning city that has not been completely built. Our cavalry can kill our way into the city from there. At that time, everything in the city will be ours. Ha ha ha. Agadorji laughed wildly on his horse, as if he had already won at this moment. It was as if the mercenaries were at his mercy. The reason why Agadorji was so confident was that the number of his cavalrymen was 3 times that of the other party. He thought in his heart that even if the other party had continuous fire guns, as long as they set up a formation, with the advantage of the cavalry's speed and number, how many people could the other party kill in a short time? Once the other party charged together, it would be the time for them to kill the other party. At that time, the advantage of the cavalry would be maximized and the victory would still belong to them. There was another point that Agadorji did not mention, and that was that he actually looked down on the Han people. Even if this Han was the loyal duke of the great Ming dynasty and was known as the god of war, it was still the same. Everyone knew that the people of the grassland ate meat. They killed cows and wolves and were ferocious. Since ancient times, the Han people took farming as their duty. They were loyal and honest and were vegetarians. It was difficult for them to be opponents of the grassland people, unless there was an emperor of great talent and a general who had won every battle. Only then could the Han people defeat the people of the grassland. Back then, Zhu Yuanzhang had spent a lot of effort to chase the Mongols back to the Mongolian grassland. Zhu Di's 5 expeditions to the Mongols had only weakened the Mongols. 20 years later, Yes Hin defeated the Ming army at the Tomb of Castle. If it was not for Yang Chendong's timely intervention, Zhu Qizhen would have been captured alive. Throughout the Ming dynasty had lost more wars than wars with the Mongols. As time passed, the strength of the Ming dynasty also decreased. With these facts in front of him, it was fine for Agadorji to be more confident. Not to mention, this time, he had brought 3 times the number of his enemies. However, he did not know that if he exaggerated his advantage and looked down on the other party, it would only cause him to lose even more miserably. It would only cause him to enter a state of no return. This was because he did not take into account the firearms in the hands of the mercenaries. In the cold weapons era, the Mongol cavalry were invincible and conquered the world. Even the Russians were slaves to the Mongols. The Golden Horde had ruled Russia for nearly 300 years. Every time the Russian nobles knelt before the Mongols would burn, kill, and plunder in Russia and commit all kinds of crimes. The Russians were angry, but they did not dare to speak out. The stars changed, and the era changed. The Western world entered the era of hot weapons. Guns and cannons were really strong, and a single cannon could kill a large number of cavalry. At the end of the Ming dynasty, Yuan Chenghuan used cannons to kill Nurhasai. The 8 Banners' disciples were like scarecrows in front of Yuan Chenghuan. During the Crow War, the British army only had a few thousand men and defeated the Qing army of over 1 million. At that time, tens of thousands of Mongol elites, led by Green Chin, attacked the British army of a few hundred. What happened? The Mongol cavalry was wiped out, and the British army only lost a few people. In the face of modernity, the Mongols were just a joke. When the Russians were in Vasilyevo, they learned from the West and used guns to conquer Siberia. How could those with knives be a match for those with guns? A few hundred Russians wiped out all the Mongols in Siberia. From then on, Russia became a huge empire that spanned across Asia and Europe. The Qing dynasty ruined the country for 300 years, and when China needed strength the most, it weakened. Chapter 705. This was the power of the flintlock in actual combat. Of course, the flintlock was not omnipotent. As long as the soldiers were united and did not fear death, it was not impossible to turn the situation around. But the problem was, what kind of fighting spirit would be needed to achieve this? At least, Agadorji could not do it. Fortunately, Yang Chendong, who was regarded as his enemy, did not intend to defend the city. He also wanted to use this opportunity to train his cavalry and decided to fight outside the city. And if he was willing to defend and not come out of the city, then not to mention the 50,000 cavalry, even if another 50,000 cavalry came, they would not be able to gain the slightest advantage. The advantage of the flintlock was more in defense, especially when facing fast cavalry. Attacking was equivalent to giving up most of one's advantages. But Yang Chendong still wanted to do this, which in itself proved that he was confident in the strength of his cavalry. Perhaps in his opinion, even if the cavalry charged, even if they used the most primitive method, his mercenaries were the strongest in the world. Of course, Yang Chendong only wanted to use this opportunity to train his cavalry. He did not really want to play to his strengths and avoid his weaknesses. He knew very well when to use the most primitive method to fight. For example, in the West River War Zone, he used the flintlock to fight against Ge Lang and his 5,000 enemy cavalry. Ge Lang obtained the qualification of the Vanguard General. This did not mean that he was brave and good at fighting, but because Su He did not fight for it and did not care about it. In the end, he was just a touchstone, a stepping stone to test the strength of the mercenaries. In front of the mercenaries, Ge Lang became a whetstone, but he did not know it. After hearing the news and making arrangements, Glenn led 5,000 cavalrymen to the West River and saw the mercenary army stationed on the other side of the river. This was the independent regiment led by Tiger's Mane. A regiment had 16 battalions, which made them far more powerful than an ordinary regiment or even a division. Both sides looked at each other across the river. Facing such a powerful opponent, Ge Lang sneered and began to arrange the cavalry to find trees and make rafts to prepare to cross the river. As a Mongolian from the grasslands, Ge Lang did not think much of the 6,000 enemies in front of him. He noticed that the other party's camp was still 3 miles away from the river, and if he could cross the river on a raft at the first moment, he could even kill his way to the front of the enemy through the West River. It was very possible for him to obtain a good start by catching them off guard. General, our cavalrymen have tested it out. There are two sections where the riverbed is relatively high, and the water flow isn't that strong. We should be able to cross the river directly, a Chiliarch reported in an agitated voice as he arrived beside Gulang. What? Glenn, who was riding a horse by the river and looking at the enemy's camp, suddenly heard this and his eyes widened. General, I've already found a suitable place to cross the river. As long as we execute it well, we might be able to catch them off guard. The Chiliarch continued in an excited manner. Gulang also became more agitated. His body even trembled slightly. Is what you said true? The riverbed is really not high, and warhorses can gallop freely? Yes, some of our brothers have lived here since young. I heard them say that when they were young, they tried to cross the river on horseback. They know where the riverbed is higher and suitable for cavalrymen. Just now, they intentionally tried it and found that there were no changes. It seems that this secret is only known by the locals. The mercenaries have just arrived and are oppressing the people of the grasslands. It is reasonable that they do not know about this. This time, not only did the Chiliarch reveal the source of the information, he also helped to analyze the weaknesses of the mercenaries. When Gu Lang heard all of this, he could not help but nod his head. Good, good. The heavens are really watching over us. Haha, since that is the case, make the arrangements. We will cross the river at night and catch them off guard. Yes, General, the Chiliarch said excitedly. If he could win this battle, it would undoubtedly be equivalent to him making a great contribution. At this moment, neither of them had the intention to send someone to inform Sir Agar Dorji, who was waiting for news at the rear. Perhaps in their eyes, any bold words were far less effective than the truth. Or perhaps they were worried that if they reported this matter, His Excellency would send someone else to carry out this mission, just like how he might send his disappointing son, Hilario, to lead the army. If that was the case, wouldn't all their previous efforts be wasted? Without informing anyone, Gulang gathered some of the Chiliarchs in the army to discuss the plan for the night. Although the riverbed was higher and they could cross the river without the use of wooden rafts, they would still have to cross the river. But after all, they were walking in muddy water. It was said that the high water level could even submerge the legs of the horses. Under such conditions, it was best to carry as little as possible so that the horses could move faster and achieve an unexpected effect. Pass down the order. Except for the necessary sabers, throw everything else on this side of the river. When we attack the beginning city, we will have all kinds of good things. Why would we care about throwing away these things? Gulang made a decision in a very generous manner. Facing this decision, no one refuted it. Perhaps the moment everyone knew that they could cross the river on horseback, they had already determined that this victory would belong to them. However, if they had heard the historical story of the drowning of the 7 armies, they would not be so optimistic. In the Independent Regiment's barracks, 3 miles away from the shore of the West River, Regiment Commander Tiger Mane was imitating the young master and staring at a simple sand table in front of him. In front of him stood a battalion commander who was reporting the enemy's movements. Commander, as expected, the other party didn't go looking for a wooden raft. Instead, they set up camp and started cooking. It seems that they have fallen into our trap. When the battalion commander said this, he was a little agitated and his eyes were a little bright. Of course, they will fall into a trap. This is the plan that the young master came up with, Tiger Mane said confidently. Then, he seemed to be worried and asked, have the upper echelons of the West River made any arrangements? As soon as the signal flare rises into the sky, they must open the floodgates and release the water. Regiment Commander, please rest assured. Deputy Regiment Commander Xian Honghai is carrying out the mission over there. There will be no problem. That's good. Tell the soldiers to get some rest and prepare to catch the fish at night. Once again, Umang's eyes revealed a strong sense of confidence. In his eyes, the 5,000 cavalrymen were already fish in the net and food on the plate. Both sides had their own arrangements and were waiting for the sky to turn dark. At the end of July, the days were long and the nights were short. The sky also turned dark late. It was not until 9 o'clock at night that the sky turned completely dark. Finally, Gulang's side began to move. Under the cover of the night, Gulang's cavalrymen began to divide into two groups and entered the West River. Following the route that they had chosen beforehand, the cavalrymen entered the water one by one like dumplings. The sound of splashing could be heard endlessly. Be careful. Don't alert the enemy. Also, don't light any torches. Don't let others discover our movements. Some of the centurions reprimanded the cavalrymen in a low voice. Then, they entered the river with a cautious look. Their movements were indeed very careful. Little did they know that there was a type of telescope called the night vision device that had already seen their every move. These pitiful cavalrymen still thought that what they were doing was undetectable. As a matter of fact, every step was seen clearly by the other party. Regiment commander, the enemy has begun to move. A soldier whispered to Tiger Mane beside a mound of dirt. As the regiment commander of an independent regiment, how could Tiger Mane be at ease if he did not see such a big event with his own eyes? Therefore, he personally came this time and saw the enemy cavalryman enter the river with his own eyes. At this moment, all the worries in his heart turned into shadows. No rush. Let's wait until their main force enters the middle of the river before opening the floodgates. It will be very exciting when that time comes. Tiger Mane's voice was filled with relaxation and satisfaction. The West River was about 300 feet wide. Due to the climate and the environment, the water supply was only sufficient during the summer rainy season. However, the distance of nearly 100 meters in the water was enough for them to walk for a while. In order to achieve the goal of catching the enemy off guard, Gulang did not make any moves. Glenn didn't have any intention of probing and decided to send his entire army in. After calculating the exact location of the two higher riverbeds, he sent all of his cavalrymen forward. It could be seen that this time, he was determined to break through to the other side of the river and deal a heavy blow to the mercenaries there. More and more cavalrymen entered the river. If one looked carefully, it seemed that everything was going smoothly. Although the deepest part of the river was already below the hooves of the war horses, the people were still fine. Since they were already prepared, the cavalrymen all held their riding boots in their hands. Even if their feet were a little wet, it did not affect them much. The first cavalrymen were already less than 20 meters away from the shore. The river began to lower again, and the army behind continued to press forward. Finally, when the first cavalryman had already leaped onto the shore, the rest of the cavalrymen entered the river. Even General Gu Lang himself entered the river under the protection of a few soldiers. Fire the signal flare. Seeing that all the enemies had entered the trap, Tiger Mane, who was hiding on the other side of the river, finally gave the order to attack. A soldier of the independent regiment beside him immediately took out the signal flare that he had prepared beforehand and fired it into the dark sky. Bang! A loud gunshot broke the silence of the night. It also broke the shackles of darkness in the dark night. What replaced it was a bright light that flashed in midair, as sudden and bright as the appearance of a meteor. Chapter 706. What's going on? Out of instinct, all the cavalrymen in the river and on the shore couldn't help but look up. They couldn't understand why such a bright white light would suddenly appear in the darkness. What was going on? Could it be that the gods had manifested? The white light slowly flew up to the sky, but when it reached a certain height, it finally started to fall slowly. It was really like a meteor, falling in midair. Then, the land returned to darkness. Although the white light wasn't there, for some reason, everyone had a bad feeling in their hearts. Naturally, they didn't know that this was a signal flare. This meant that the mercenaries were about to launch an all-out attack. However, their intuition told them that this sudden appearance wasn't a good sign. Once the bad feeling appeared, it was quickly confirmed. First, there was a slightly anxious but indescribable sound that resounded in their ears. The sound was very soft at the beginning, but it became very clear later on. It became louder and louder until it couldn't be stopped. Not good. There were some people in the crowd who knew how to swim and had lived by the river since they were young. Their expressions changed drastically as they suddenly shouted, "It's the sound of the river rushing. We've fallen into a trap. The upstream river must have been blocked before, and now the sluice gate is suddenly opened. Quick, let's rush to the other side of the river. Quick, quick, rush over and we'll live." Otherwise, we'll definitely die if we stay in the water. Quickly rush to the other side of the river. Quick. Obviously, more than one person understood this principle. The sound of the flowing water became louder and louder, and finally, all kinds of shouts were heard. However, because there were too many people shouting, they couldn't hear clearly. Those who understood naturally urged their horses forward with all their might. Those who couldn't hear clearly were still stunned. They looked around blankly, as if they were still waiting for an explanation. Hua, hua, hua. The sound of the flowing water was finally getting closer. The most direct reaction was that the water that could only submerge the hooves of the war horses suddenly reached the waist of the war horses. Then, it submerged the entire war horses. Even the cavalrymen on the war horses tilted and fell into the river with a splash. Such a scene happened more and more. Many soldiers who couldn't react in time fell into the river in fear. In such a turbulent river in the middle of the night, even some of the soldiers who were good at swimming would not be spared. Not to mention that many of the cavalrymen's feet were still attached to the stirrups of their horses, greatly hindering their movements. The moment the war horses were washed away by the river, it was already an indication of how many cavalrymen had fallen into the death trap. Under the pressure of death, more and more cavalrymen unleashed their potential and rushed to the other side of the river. It was less than 100 meters away, but at this moment, it was as if a chasm had appeared in front of them, making them feel as if they were so close yet so far away. Even the cavalrymen who were lucky enough to reach the shore weren't safe. On the contrary, after they had exhausted all their strength to reach the other side, what awaited them was a series of arrows that rained down on them. Under such an indiscriminate barrage of arrows, it was difficult for anyone to truly survive. A few lucky people rode on their war horses and broke through the rain. Just as they were about to reach the soldiers of the independent regiment who had been waiting for them, hundreds of loaded muskets were waiting for them. They were waiting for the scene of their bodies turning into a hornet's nest. Glenn's luck wasn't bad. He had just entered the river when he realized that the situation wasn't right. Under the protection of a few bodyguards, he retreated. He was one of the lucky ones among the 5,000. When the river suddenly rose under artificial control, his face turned pale and he kept repeating, "It's over. It's over. It's all over." Out of the 5,000 cavalrymen, only he and his 8 bodyguards managed to escape. The other brothers either died in the water or under the strong bows and muskets of the mercenaries. From the beginning to the end, they didn't even see the enemy's figure clearly. From the beginning to the end, they didn't even have the chance to brandish their sabers and fight with the enemy. 5,000 cavalrymen were finished just like that. "General, let's retreat quickly. It won't be long before the enemy arrives on the wooden raft." "It'll be difficult to retreat then," the 8 bodyguards said with ugly expressions. The scene before them also made them feel a lingering fear. However, they couldn't think too much about it. Leaving this place as soon as possible was the most important thing. "All right, retreat, retreat." Although Glenn was very reluctant and even wanted to take another look, he knew that there was no need for the 9 of them to stay here any longer. It was better to report the situation truthfully. When the time came, he could accept his fate. Glenn escaped. Not long after he left with his 8 bodyguards, the deputy commander of the independent regiment, Xian Honghai, arrived with a battalion of 400 cavalrymen. They first opened the sluice and released the water. Then, they rushed upstream to the shallowest side of the river. They didn't find a single enemy cavalryman. Instead, they saw all sorts of supplies thrown on the ground. Among them were many sabers, scabbards, quivers, and other combat equipment. These were the supplies that Glenn and the others had temporarily thrown down to reduce their weight. "Haha, we didn't come here for nothing. Pick up all these things and bring them back." Xian Honghai laughed loudly. The battle was nearing its end. After the investigation, other than Glenn, who took 8 bodyguards with him when he escaped, the other 4,991 cavalrymen were mostly dead. Among them, about 600 people rushed to the other side of the river, but all of them died under the arrows and bullets. As for the other 4,000 people, at least half of them became water ghosts in the West River. They couldn't be more dead than they were. Only a few lucky ones who were good at swimming managed to escape. Sigh, If it wasn't for the urgency of the situation and the enemy's main forces arriving tomorrow, I really couldn't bear to see so many warhorses get washed away. What a pity. The commander of the independent regiment, Tiger's Mane, was still lamenting. In the end, he waved his hand and said, "Clean up the battlefield. Throw the enemy's corpses into the holes we dug long ago. Chop off their heads and make them into statues. Bring the warhorses back to the city. Hurry up and deal with everything." The moment Yang Chendong set up the plan to drown the enemy, the fate of the 5,000 cavalrymen seemed to have been decided. They didn't know that Yang Chendong was the best at dealing with the people. One of the things he often did was to understand the customs and habits of the people when he arrived at a place. How could he not know the structure of the bottom of the West River? This time, he intentionally intercepted the flow of the river in advance to create an illusion that the enemy could cross the river. The facts also proved that the enemy was fooled, and they had to pay the price in blood and lives. Tiger's Mane led the independent regiment to successfully finish the first battle. They killed 5,000 enemies without losing a single person and seized countless war supplies. When they entered the city at dawn, they were treated like heroes who had returned. The people in the beginning city spontaneously came to both sides of the streets to celebrate and cheer. They already knew that Agadorji was going to bring 50,000 cavalrymen to attack the beginning city. The grassland people who knew this person were naturally afraid. They didn't think that this person's arrival would bring them any good luck. They were worried about whether the mercenaries could successfully defend the city and continue the beautiful life that had just begun. Now that they had such a beautiful opening battle with the independent regiment, they could finally put down their worries a little. On the streets of the beginning city, in front of more than 10,000 people, Yang Chendong personally came out to welcome them. He also ordered people to bring 5 carriages of gold and silver treasures. These were all rewards for the soldiers of the independent regiment who had performed meritorious deeds. Yang Chendong also announced on the streets that no matter who it was, no matter what race they were, as long as they sincerely joined the mercenaries and performed well on the battlefield, they would be rewarded. They would have the possibility of being promoted and becoming a general to bring honor to their ancestors. Facts spoke louder than words. When the 5 carriages of shining gold and silver were placed on the streets and given to the officers of the independent regiment in front of everyone, the surrounding 10,000 people were deeply stimulated. Among them, there were some warriors who had participated in tribal wars or fought against the grassland bandits for their own safety. However, because there was no one to report to, because there were too many concerns, because they didn't receive rewards for their meritorious deeds, and so on, they chose to leave their original army and become ordinary people again. However, they were still grassland warriors in their bones. They didn't join the army and didn't join any side. It wasn't that they didn't dare to do it or didn't want to do it. It was because they didn't want to. It was because they didn't think that the people they should work for had appeared, or they felt that their efforts couldn't be proportional to what they received. But now, Yang Chendong gave them a vivid lesson, letting them know that there was such an army in the world. As long as they performed meritorious deeds, they would receive sufficient rewards. Now, they only had to consider whether their own abilities were enough. Do you still want people? Finally, some people in the crowd who were unwilling and moved asked a question that many people wanted to ask. That depends on the situation. Just go to the recruitment office in the city and ask. Beta Persei's loud voice came in handy. He, who had long received Yang Chendong's instructions, took the initiative to speak loudly at this moment. His voice quickly spread among the people. It didn't take long for everyone to know about this matter. Some people were also eager to give it a try. They wanted to wait for the war to end. If the mercenaries could really prove that they could defeat an enemy several times their number, then they would consider joining this army and fight for a future for their future and their descendants. Chapter 707. Yang Chendong saw all of this. This was also the reason why he threw out gold and silver on the street. Although raising an army required food and gold and silver, the more troops there were, the heavier the burden. In the current situation, he didn't have any plans to recruit soldiers, but it didn't stop him from preparing early. This way, if he needed soldiers, there would be an endless supply of backup troops for him to choose from. Originally, although the independent regiment's mission was completed beautifully, they opened the floodgates and unleashed continuous attacks with bows and arrows. In fact, this battle wasn't dangerous at all, but he still wanted to praise them with great fanfare. It was for the sake of buying horse bones with 1,000 gold. Now, it seemed that it was effective. On the way back to the largest city lord mansion in the beginning city, he chuckled and said to Zhue Feng, Lujua, Yila, and the other commanders, "Did you see that? Many of the people below have the intention to join the army. So, you can fight the next few battles without worry. Once there are any losses, I will give you the number of new soldiers no matter how many warriors you lose. I will ensure the integrity of your organization. Just give it your all." Yes, sixth young master. Zhue Feng and the others all cupped their fists and said respectfully. The last worry was gone. Even if the army was crippled, it could be quickly replenished. What was there to be afraid of? Next, they just had to give it their all. Compared to the excitement of the mercenaries, the Tatars were furious. Their angry shouts could be heard clearly from tens of feet away from the tent. You lost just like that. How can you still have the face to come back? Why didn't you die in the West River? Do you know that you brought 5,000 cavalrymen? 5,000 cavalrymen. You all died in less than an hour. How can you still have the face to come back? How can you still have the face to come back? Men, drag Gulang out and behead him to show our military might. Father, don't be angry, don't be angry. Another slightly younger voice sounded. Yes, please calm down. Horses can stumble. Victory and defeat are common on the battlefield. Besides, it's inauspicious to kill a general in the middle of a battle. Please give General Gulang a chance to redeem himself. Another calm voice sounded. Needless to say, the one who was angry was Agar Dorji. The next to speak were his son, Hilaruo, and another tiger general, Su He. After being persuaded by his son and his subordinates, Agar Dorji knew that he couldn't kill them. Otherwise, it would only disappoint everyone. Most importantly, the enemy was right in front of them, and they needed people. Not only was it inauspicious to kill a general before the battle, he couldn't find a general more capable than Gulang. He thought to himself, although Glenn is responsible for his negligence in this battle, isn't it because the enemy was too arrogant and took the initiative to set a trap? Even if it wasn't Gulang this time, if it was someone else, it was hard to guarantee that they wouldn't fall into the trap. Forcibly gasping for a few breaths, Agadorji looked at Gulang, who was kneeling on the ground, trembling with fear, and said angrily, Fine. This time, Su He and Hiraruo pleaded for you, so I'll spare your life for now. However, you have to redeem yourself. If you make any mistakes, you will be executed without mercy. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Gulang knocked his head on the ground like he was pounding garlic, and the cold sweat on his head finally disappeared a lot. Gulang was defeated, and his 5,000 cavalrymen were all dead. This was equivalent to a wake-up call for Agar Dorji. Facing such a powerful opponent like the mercenaries, he had to put away all his tricks and luck. Next, he had to fight a proper battle and defeat the enemy head-on. Thinking about it, he now had more than twice the number of the enemy. Even if he fought them head-on, there was nothing to fear. Pass down the order, the army will rest for a day. Tomorrow morning, we will head to the West River. I want to see what tricks the enemy has that can stop our army from advancing. Agar Dorji finally gave the final word and shook the drums. There wasn't much time left before dawn. When the sun rose, the army set out, and it only took them 4 hours to reach the West River. Compared to last night, the river here had become a lot more turbulent. What was more striking was that on the opposite side of the river, there was a statue made up of about 600 skulls. It seemed to be narrating the tragic battle that had happened here last night. Agar Dorji glared angrily at the human skulls on the other side of the river. He clenched his fists and shouted angrily, Mercenaries, when we defeat you, we will definitely build an even bigger skulls and let everyone know what the consequences of angering us are. Men, test the river. As soon as the order was given, the soldiers who were good at swimming began to try to cross the river. However, in the face of the turbulent river, after several failed attempts, it was announced that the idea of crossing the West River would not work. At least, they shouldn't think about it for the next few days. Sir, the sluice gate of the upstream river has been opened. It is obviously impossible to cross from here. It is better to find another way. Seeing that the army stopped here and faced the statue that was still emitting the smell of blood, the longer they stayed, the lower the morale of the army would be. Suhi had no choice but to stand up. General Su, do you have any good ideas? Agar Dorji asked calmly. Sir, if we want to get close to the origin city now, there are only 3 ways. First, we can go around the north side and enter from the north slope. Second, we can build a raft and cross the West River by force. Third, we can go around the south side and rush to the south gate of the origin city from the southern forest. Su He, who said the 3 methods in one breath, caused Agar Dorji to nod. This was what a brave general should do. He would not be like his son, Hararuo, and General Gu Lang, who could only look at the river and sigh. Seeing that Agar Dorji nodded in approval of his suggestion, Su He continued, it is not advisable to cross the river with a raft. Who knows what kind of reaction the mercenaries will have if we build a raft here? If they attack us with arrows halfway, we will inevitably suffer heavy losses. As for the north slope, the terrain there is easy to defend and difficult to attack. It is also not suitable for cavalry to attack. Only the southern forest in the south is suitable for an ambush. However, as long as we are prepared and the area is in a vast location, we can still fight. Of course, how to decide, sir? Please make the decision. After analyzing everything, Su He was able to hold his own. In the end, he still gave the choice to Agar Dorji. Such a capable and sensible subordinate would naturally win the favor of his superiors. At this moment, Agar Dorji's expression became much better after hearing these words. General Su is right. Then, according to you, we should go through the southern forest? If this subordinate can think of this, then the mercenaries must have thought of this as well. Therefore, we still need to listen to Sir's final decision. Suhi held his fist and said, His words reminded Agar Dorji of something. Yes, all of this analysis seemed to be correct, but how could the mercenaries not know? It was not hard to imagine that the mercenaries would definitely ambush a large number of cavalry in the southern forest to attack him. If that was the case, how should he deal with it? All of a sudden, everyone stopped moving, and the surroundings fell into a state of silence. Gu Lang, who was in the middle of this, blinked his eyes continuously. Then, as if he had thought of something, he whispered, Sir, this subordinate has something to say, but I don't know if it is appropriate. Speak. When Agar Dorji was at his wit's end, the general below had a suggestion. Of course, he had to listen to it. It was time for Gu Lang to perform meritorious deeds. If there was a chance to perform meritorious deeds again, of course, he would not hide anything. After getting permission, he said, Sir, this subordinate thinks like this. After all, the number of mercenaries in the first city is limited. Although they have the geographical advantage, if we can divide our troops and attack from several directions, I think it will inevitably lead them to divide their troops as well. In this way, the strength of their attack on us will be much weaker. Moreover, once we divide our forces, not only will their threat to us be reduced to the minimum, even if something happens and we lose one of our routes, at least the other 2 routes will be safe, and we will still have the possibility of taking down the first city. Oh? This makes sense. As if suddenly enlightened, Agar Dorji felt his eyes lit up at this moment. Yes, his advantage was that he had more troops, which was the weakness of the other party. If he was willing to divide his troops, it would be equivalent to forcing the other party to divide their troops. In this way, wouldn't the advantage be in his hands? Thinking of this, Agar Dorji seemed to see hope. He first laughed and then said, Yes, isn't the enemy's troops small? If that's the case, we will immediately divide our troops and force the other party to divide their troops. In this way, the advantage will be in my hands. Well, let's do it this way. If Hala comes out, where's my son? I will give you 5,000 cavalrymen. Immediately build a raft and look for an opportunity to cross the river. Remember, if there is a chance, cross it. If there is no chance, stay here and delay the other party. General Gu Lang, I will give you 10,000 cavalrymen to go to the north slope. If there is a chance, break through. If there is no chance, find a way to restrain the other party. Once you find that the other party's soldiers guarding the slope have retreated, it will be the time for us to succeed. At that time, You can send troops to attack the north slope and go straight to the north gate of the first city. General Su Gu, you and I will lead 25,000 cavalrymen to the southern forest. With the advantage of our military strength, even if we meet them, they will not have as many soldiers as we do. When the time comes, we will see General's elegance on the battlefield. Yes, sir. For a moment, the three generals who were named nodded and agreed. The three of them did not raise any objections to this division of labor. Hala's ability was the worst, and he was Agar Dorji's son. Finding a way to cross the river was the safest route. It was the most appropriate place to guard. Gulang's ability was the second best. Guarding the north slope, he could attack and defend. The possibility of accidents would also be much lower. The arrangement could be said to be appropriate. As for Su He, who was the strongest, he was arranged to go with Agar Dorji. He would lead the most troops and be the main force to threaten the first city. It was the most appropriate arrangement. Chapter 708. Finally, the 40,000-strong army was divided into 3 groups, and then they left. In an instant, only 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen were left in front of the West River. Everything that happened here was also discovered by the reconnaissance battalion cavalrymen on the other side of the river. They quickly reported it. The enemy divided their forces? Very good. Yang Chendong was not anxious when he heard the news. Instead, he laughed loudly. This was the same as what he and the other officers had imagined. Facing the first city that seemed to be full of loopholes, the enemy seemed to want to attack from multiple angles. This was exactly what Yang Chendong wanted. If the enemy combined their forces, no matter where they chose to attack, they would have to pay a high price to stop them. After all, this was 40,000 cavalrymen. The 3 divisions of the Cold Vanguard Division, who were the best at guns, were not here. It was impossible to win without paying a price with the Type 81 rifles of the Independent Regiment. However, if the enemy divided their forces, it would be different. This was equivalent to the enemy dividing their powerful fist into several parts. This would give them a chance to defeat them one by one. Dispatch the reconnaissance battalion. Be prepared to kill all the enemy scouts who are responsible for communicating with each other. When the time is up, they are not allowed to communicate with each other. The other battalions will carry out the plan according to the previous plan. Everyone, go and make your preparations. Not long after Yang Chendong's voice fell, the meeting room that was full of officers quickly became quiet again. Yang Chendong once again walked in front of the sand table to confirm if there were any loopholes in his military plan. According to the first plan, the deputy commander of the Independent Regiment, Xian Honghai, led 6 battalions to the West River and set up a formation there. Whenever the enemy tried to cross the river, they would attack across the river and kill the Tatar cavalrymen halfway across the river. Because they were on wooden rafts, there was no space to dodge. Once the arrows came, they could only let the arrows fall on their bodies. After 2 consecutive attempts to cross the river, not only did they not succeed, but they also lost hundreds of cavalrymen. Too despicable. Hilario stood on the riverbank and said angrily as he watched the mercenaries launch their arrows. Although he was angry, there was nothing he could do. After all, the river was nearly 100 meters wide, which was the limit of the bow and arrow. Even if he wanted to use the bow and arrow to suppress it, he couldn't do it. On the other hand, the moment his cavalry crossed the river, it would be equivalent to entering the enemy's firing range. It would be strange if they weren't attacked. Let's wait for a while. I don't believe that they won't run out of arrows. Once the other 2 armies achieve victory, the enemy will have no choice but to retreat back into the city. At that time, it will be time for us to cross the river and attack. One of the 1,000-man commanders said to Hilario in an encouraging manner, "Looks like that's the only way." Hilario nodded. The mission his father gave him was the safest. If there was an opportunity, they would attack. If there was no opportunity, they would just stay here and exhaust the enemy. As long as they could cause the enemy to leave some troops here, it could be considered a victory. After comforting himself, Hilario gave the order that no one was allowed to attack before the enemy split up their forces. Everyone just had to wait and use this opportunity to conserve their strength. Once they found an opportunity, they would charge across the river and kill the enemy. Reporting to 6th Young Master, the enemy on the other side of the river has indeed become much more obedient. After waiting for one more day, we can consider withdrawing as planned. Vice Commander Xian Honghai said to the soldier beside him with a smile as he watched the performance of Halarua and the others through the binoculars. At the same time, General Golang had no choice but to give the same order after charging twice. Facing them was a strengthened group of mercenary cavalry, a total of 3,200 people. It was enough to achieve the effect of winning with fewer troops. General Golang, who led 10,000 troops, couldn't find a chance to win. He had no choice but to place his hopes on the mercenaries to take the initiative to retreat. When the pressure from the front decreased, it would naturally be the time for him to wait for an opportunity to attack. Regardless of whether it was the West River or the North Slope, such a situation had occurred within Yang Qindong's expectations. Due to the topography of these two places, he was not worried at all. Only the southern forest, due to the topography, was the most important battlefield. The performance there would directly affect the overall situation. Beta Persei informed the guards to gather. We will go to the southern forest to take a look. The plan was set. There was no point in staying in the command center. Yang Qindong wanted to personally go to the front line and see what kind of strength the so-called Tatar cavalry had on the battlefield. Southern Forest. The 20,000 Tatar elites led by Agar Dorje were already prepared for the charge of 10,000 cavalry. In order to achieve the purpose of killing the enemy, General Su He took the order to become the vanguard general. He led 10,000 cavalrymen and was ready to rush here at any time, enter the beginning city, and even attack the city. Just opposite the main Tatar cavalry, the Nuzan cavalry regiment with 3,000 people also lined up in a battle formation, ready to fight at any time. Although they had fewer people in terms of numbers, they were not weaker than their opponents in terms of momentum. This was not only because the Nuzan cavalry regiment had won many battles since its establishment and was in an excellent state, but also because they knew that there were no less than 6,000 people lying in ambush in the nearby southern forest. They could support them on the battlefield at any time. In fact, the 10 battalions of the independent regiment had a total of 4,000 people. Among them, there were 2 battalions of musketeers holding Type 81 guns. In addition, the 2,000 people under the 2nd Cavalry Regiment Lujua were lying in ambush here, ready to support at any time. According to the plan, whether or not they could block the main force of the Tatar army at the southern forest would determine whether or not the first plan could be carried out smoothly. If they could not even block the main force of the enemy, then they could only retreat to the beginning city, and the trap they set for the enemy would no longer be useful. Su He was riding on a valiant warhorse, wearing a suit of armor to protect the important parts of his body as much as possible. His eyes were bright and full of expression as he stared at the enemy cavalry. He revealed a fierce gaze, and from time to time, he would glance at the southern forest, which seemed to have millions of soldiers lying in ambush, proving that he was very worried in his heart. It was completely different from the calmness and confidence he showed. The southern forest was suitable for hiding a large number of ambushing troops, which anyone could see. But the problem was how many enemy troops were lying in ambush here. According to the information sent by the Fast Horse Scout just now, more than 2,000 mercenaries were found in front of the West River, and at least 3,000 enemy cavalry were found on the north slope. So, there should be less than 10,000 mercenaries left, but there were only 3,000 enemy cavalry in front of him. Where did the remaining 6,000 or 7,000 mercenaries go? Would they be lying in ambush in the southern forest, waiting for him to lead the main force to charge up and then suddenly attack from the side? If that was the case, how much confidence did he have in winning? In other words, how much support could Agar Dorje give him at the critical moment? Would he be able to lead the remaining 10,000 Tatar cavalry to help him? Su He did not have much confidence in this point, not because of anything else, but because he knew Lord Agar Dorje too well. In order to achieve his goals, this person would often use unscrupulous means. In other words, in order to win, he was even willing to risk his son, Har Dorje, not to mention that he was only a general under Lord Agar Dorje. He was an existence that could be sacrificed at any time. Because he knew the general too well, Su He was unable to fight with all his strength. After thinking about it again and again, he decided that he could not send out 10,000 cavalry all at once. Since the enemy only sent out 3,000 cavalry, He could send out 5,000 cavalry to probe the enemy. Men, send out 5,000 cavalry vanguards. We must break through the enemy cavalry's obstruction. After making up his mind, Suhi gave the order as the vanguard commander. The bugle horns sounded, and 10,000 horses galloped forward, kicking up clouds of dust as they galloped forward. 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry sounded the horn to charge. They shouted loudly in their own language and charged forward. Looking from afar, it was as if the autumn wind was sweeping away the fallen leaves, sweeping over everything. The enemy has started to charge. Tell the brothers not to be nervous. Let the muskets exhaust them first. The commander of the Nuzan cavalry, Yella, held the reins of his warhorse and said while suppressing the excited neighs of his warhorse. As a result, the 3,000 Nuzan cavalry did not move. They only stared at the incoming enemy, occasionally glancing at Yella. Once the commander gave the order to charge, they would rush out as fast as possible to accomplish their mission. What's going on? Why didn't he send out all 10,000 cavalry? Why did he only send out half of them? What is Suhi doing? At the back of the Tatar cavalry, Agar Dorj said with displeasure when he saw that they only sent out 5,000 cavalry. After saying this, Agar Dorj thought of something. He knew that Suhi did not trust him. It was as if he was afraid that Agar Dorj would not save him if he was surrounded. This made Agar Dorj a little unhappy. He actually dared to disobey his orders. It seemed that after this battle, he would have to teach the other party a lesson. Back on the battlefield, the 5,000 Tatar cavalry began their charge. The enemy was only 3 li away from each other. With the neighing of the warhorses, this short distance would take less than a quarter of an hour to reach the enemy. Seeing that the mercenaries didn't move an inch even after she sent out the cavalry, Suhi had a bad feeling about this. Most of the time, intuition on the battlefield was very scary. As soon as Suhi's uneasy feeling came out, it came true. She saw that the originally quiet Nanlin forest suddenly burst with the sound of fire guns, like firecrackers, continuous and endless. Chapter 709. Looking at the charging 5,000 Tatar cavalry, the charging formation was in chaos. Then, one after another, the cavalry fell off their horses. One after another, the strong war horses became ownerless. They stopped in front of their owners and lowered their heads, as if saying, "Get up. I'm still waiting for you to lead me into battle." It's the mercenaries' muskets. Seeing this scene, Suhi reacted and his heart sank. Although he already knew this before the battle, Suhi was still shocked when he saw the power of the muskets. He calculated that this wave of attack alone killed about 1,000 cavalry. This greatly reduced the number of cavalry on both sides, making his advantage infinitely smaller. Kill. The remaining 4,000 Tatar cavalry finally broke through the blockade of the muskets with the help of the speed of the horses, allowing them to come within a mile of the Nuzan cavalry. Prepare the bows and arrows. Charge with me. Seeing that the enemy was seriously injured, Yella laughed and then reached out to block the strong bow hanging on his horse. He shouted and urged his horse to charge. The other 3,000 Nuzan cavalry soldiers who couldn't wait for a long time followed suit and took out their bows and arrows. They raised their bows and were ready to shoot at any time. Finally, the battle is about to begin. Suhi opened his eyes wide and stared at the scene in front of him. This was a good opportunity to observe the strength of the mercenaries' cavalry. After escaping from the muskets, he hoped that his Tatar cavalry could play a role in suppressing the mercenaries' cavalry. This was their only chance to turn the tables. Arrows shot from afar, close combat, sabers raised high, cavalry charged. After 1,000 cavalry were killed by the muskets, the Tatar cavalry's morale couldn't help but drop. Many people were terrified because they couldn't see where the enemy was and could die under the muskets of the enemy at any time. This made them think of the scene when they faced the Ming army's Divine Machine Battalion. Who knew how many ancestors died under those hateful muskets? Now, this scene fell on them. They really had a feeling that they couldn't resist. Fortunately, they finally rushed over. Now, they were about to engage in a charging battle with the enemy cavalry. This was their strength. They hoped to turn the situation around in this battle. Similarly, the 4,000-strong Tatar cavalrymen started shooting at the Nuzan cavalrymen. From panic to calmness, from being beaten to fighting back with all their strength. The 4,000 Tatar cavalry perfectly displayed the word elite. Both sides began to shoot at a distance of only 1 mile. Both sides' horses were galloping. Under the situation where each person could shoot at most 2 arrows, it was difficult to say who would win. As the arrows continued to fly about, the cavalrymen fell from their horses one after another. The war horses stopped charging and became ownerless. In just 2 waves of archery, both the Nuzan cavalry and the Tatar cavalry paid the price of hundreds of cavalry deaths. In the end, they switched to using bows and arrows to fight in close combat. Kill. The deputy commander of the Nuzan cavalry division, Lu Dai, took the lead and led her men into the formation of the Tatar cavalry like an arrow. As the commander, Yella led most of the cavalry to engage in guerrilla warfare. This was a tactic that had been discussed before. A cavalry couldn't be without a commander. Otherwise, the army would be like a sheet of loose sand. Without a commander, they would be defeated one by one. Deputy Commander Lu Dai killed his way in. Along with him were 1,000 Nuzan cavalry soldiers. They followed behind the deputy commander and waved their sharp sabers at the Tatar cavalry around them. In history, the Mongol cavalry was once the subordinate of the Nuzan cavalry. In the end, with their help, the Nuzan defeated the Ming dynasty and established the Qing dynasty. But that was something that would happen more than 100 years later. In this era, the Mongol cavalry was still the strongest cavalry in the world. The Nuzan cavalry was still nothing in their eyes. Reality also proved that the Tatar cavalry was indeed the elite of the Mongolian cavalry. Be it their fighting spirit or their skillful operation and performance, they were slightly stronger than the Nuzan cavalry. If it were not for the fact that the Nuzan cavalry's sabers were sharper and tougher, and if they did not learn the 3-to-3 strategy from Long Feng, where every 3 horses could form a small fighting group and fight with the enemy, the Nuzan cavalry would not be able to win against the Tatar cavalry. Use the advantage of the saber to increase the speed of your chopping. Commander Yella, who was roaming around the periphery, saw that both sides were actually evenly matched. Because they had fewer people than the enemy's 1,000 cavalry, their losses were even greater. Finally, he couldn't sit still anymore and began to shout loudly to remind his subordinates. If they wanted to use the advantage of the saber, they needed to cut the enemy's saber in half and obtain the advantage of the weapon. With Yella's shout, the Nuzan cavalrymen seemed to have woken up from a dream. They increased the speed at which they swung their sabers, forcing their opponents to fight back. After several collisions, the results finally appeared. Many of the Tatar cavalrymen had cracks on their sabers, and some of them even broke in half. The saber suddenly breaking in half was undoubtedly fatal for the cavalry who were in the middle of a fight. When the same saber was chopped over, the enemy's saber had already stabbed into his heart. However, your saber did not even touch the enemy's clothes. What kind of result would that be? The advantage of the saber was brought into play. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were caught off guard. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were chopped off their horses. The situation on both sides was reversing. Charge! Right at this moment, another group of cavalrymen dressed entirely in black iron, and even their war horses were covered in black iron armor, suddenly charged out from the side. Although they didn't have many people, their momentum was astonishing. Their black clothes and black faces emitted a cold and powerful aura. Their bodies were impervious to swords and spears. When this group of 100 people entered the battlefield, they became the mouth of a giant beast that devoured people's lives. They killed the Tartar cavalry, and no one could stop them. Is that the enemy, the black cavalry that young master spoke of? Suhi also quickly discovered the existence of the black cavalry. When he saw the other party's heroic performance and killing as if there was no one around, he couldn't help but gasp. He saw with his own eyes that at least a few sabers had hacked at the enemy's black armor. However, apart from producing some weak sparks, they were unable to cause any damage. On the contrary, the Tatar cavalry that attacked were continuously killed by the Heike cavalry. In just a short while, the Heike cavalry had killed over 100 elite Tatar cavalry. The appearance of the black cavalry seemed to have blown the horn of the enemy's counterattack. Several thousand cavalrymen rushed out of the southern forest. They were the troops of Lujua of the 2nd Reinforced Cavalry Regiment. 2,000 men of this regiment were thrown into the battlefield. They appeared like a gust of wind sweeping away fallen leaves. It was as if a steel knife had stabbed into the side of the Tartar cavalrymen and caught them unprepared. Charge! Charge with me! Seeing the mercenaries that were lying in ambush in the southern forest charging out, Suhi knew that there was no need to wait any longer. With a loud shout, he urged his horse to charge out. Suhi's horsemanship was indeed very good. His entire body was bent over the side of the horse's back. This way, not only could he reduce the resistance of the horse's advance, but more importantly, he could avoid the bullets to the greatest extent. In the southern forest, Tiger's Mane and 10 battalions of independent soldiers were already prepared to open fire. But facing the superb horsemanship of the Tatar cavalry, they had a feeling that they did not know where to start. Seeing that the Tatar cavalry had already broken through the blockade in front of them, many of the soldiers could not help but shout, "Commander, let's shoot the horses." "No," young master said that we should try our best not to harm the horses. Tiger's Mane shook his head affirmatively. Then, he pulled out his saber and said decisively, "Everyone, listen to my order. Leave 2 musket battalions to suppress the main force of the Tatar army. The rest of you, get on your horses and charge with me."
Yes.
After receiving the order, the 3,000 soldiers of the independent regiment let out a roar in unison. They shouted and got on their horses, pulled out their sabers, and charged towards the battlefield from the southern forest. Bullets whistled past his ears, scaring Suhi so much that he broke out in a cold sweat. But when he turned around and saw that the majority of the cavalry was not affected by the muskets, he could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. It seemed that the enemy's muskets were not omnipotent. As long as they dodged well, they could still be safe. This result also increased Suhi's confidence in winning. Leading the 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry, their momentum became stronger and their charging speed also became faster. On the main battlefield, because Yang Chendong led 100 shadow cavalry to join in at the right time, the Tatar cavalry had been separated and they began to encircle and annihilate them. Suhi had no choice but to join in the battle. However, even with the addition of 2,000 cavalrymen from the 2nd Regiment and 3,000 cavalrymen from the Independent Regiment, they were still unable to turn the situation around. On the contrary, the addition of 5,000 cavalrymen was like adding fuel to the fire. They were still tightly suppressed. Suhi watched as the main force of the mercenaries pressed forward with his appearance. His heart was faintly excited. He said to a bannerman beside him, "Quick, inform His Excellency. Ask him to immediately dispatch his troops and attack the main force of the mercenaries together with our army." After the bannerman complied, he used a special method to inform the 10,000 Tatar soldiers of Suhi's order. However, the scene that Suhi was looking forward to did not happen. On the contrary, the scene that he was worried about happened. Agador began to hesitate at this moment. He wanted to protect himself and did not rush forward with his main force. Chapter 7:10. My lord, General Suhi has made another request. A Chiliarch appeared beside Agar Dorji and reported anxiously, "I know, but have you noticed that there are still figures moving in the southern forest? If I'm not wrong, those are the flintlock soldiers left behind by the mercenaries. They are waiting for us to appear." Agadorji said calmly. At the same time, he pointed to the depths of the southern forest, as if he had already seen through everything. Without knowing the details of the mercenaries, Agar Dorji would never put himself in danger. This was his cautiousness, but it was also a sign of cowardice and lack of confidence. Of course, even if he did not take the risk, it did not mean that he would not force others to take the risk. After he shifted his gaze away from the southern forest, he said to the Chiliarch beside him, "Inform Gulang and Haruo that we are currently fighting with the mercenary army's main force here in the southern forest and have achieved certain results. It won't be long before there will be signs of a lack of troops. Ask them to seize the opportunity to counterattack. Whoever can reach the beginning city first will be rewarded with 10,000 taels of silver." Yes, Agar Dorji didn't want to take the risk himself, but he placed his hopes on his subordinates. Just as General Suhi thought, even his son was included in the plan. The messenger left after receiving the order. And just after the messenger passed the order, they didn't know that the mercenaries had begun to take action. They cut off the communication between the three parties at the right time, making it impossible for follow-up information to flow smoothly. This made this order the last one issued by Agar Dorji. The battle was still going on ahead. Suhi led the last 5,000 cavalrymen into the battlefield, but he still couldn't gain an overwhelming advantage. Instead, as the battle dragged on, the sharp and tough sabers in the hands of the mercenaries played an absolute role. More and more Tatar cavalrymen's sabers were broken, and their combat strength rapidly declined. The addition of the Independent Regiment and the 2nd Cavalry Regiment greatly relieved the pressure of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment. In addition, the Black Cavalry led by Yang Chendong was invincible. The 100 of them forcibly fought with the momentum of a magnificent army. The death rate of the Tatar cavalrymen began to rise. Retreat. After chopping down one of the mercenary cavalrymen, Suhi was a little out of breath as he watched more and more of his companions fall off their horses and die. With no reinforcements appearing behind him, he knew that if this continued, all of his cavalrymen would die here. He believed that this was an opportunity. He also believed that the mercenaries did not have many soldiers left. Unfortunately, his abilities were limited, and the number of soldiers he could command was also limited. At this moment, he could no longer see any hope of victory and could only choose to retreat. Pass down my order. All troops retreat. With reluctance and unwillingness, Suhi finally gave the order to retreat. Although he would have to sacrifice a lot of people, he couldn't care less at this moment. Once the order was given, military orders would be obeyed. The Tatar cavalry quickly broke away from the mercenaries and started to look for an opportunity to retreat. But the two sides were still entangled before, so how could one side retreat just because they wanted to? Riding on the White Dragon, Yang Chendong had already killed countless enemy cavalrymen. Seeing that the enemies around him were getting fewer and fewer, he guessed the other party's intention and shouted, "Entangle them and kill as many as you can. Order the Independent Regiment soldiers in the forest to shoot people if they can. If they can't shoot people, then shoot horses. We must strive to inflict the greatest damage to the enemy." Beta Persei and the guards, who were responsible for protecting Yang Chendong's safety, received the military order and immediately rode away to convey it. After receiving the military order, the entire mercenary army entangled the Tatar cavalry with the momentum of an army. With a crushing momentum, they left behind nearly 1,000 cavalrymen in a very short period of time. Suhi was the first group of people to withdraw. On the way back, he naturally encountered the long-range attack of the two Independent Regiment firearms battalions that had long been prepared. This time, they were not so lucky. Under the order to shoot people but not horses, many of the Tatar cavalrymen who were hiding on the side of their horses fell to the ground because their horses were shot. Their heads were bleeding, and they suffered heavy losses. When Suhi finally escaped back to Agador Dorji with the army, he discovered that out of the original 10,000 cavalrymen, only 6,000 had really escaped. Seriously counting, in addition to the 1,000 cavalrymen who were injured by the muskets at the beginning and another 1,000 cavalrymen who died during the battle, they had paid the price of nearly 2,000 cavalrymen when they finally escaped. In less than 2 hours, they had lost 40% of their forces. Moreover, they were the most elite cavalrymen. This made Suhi, who was the commanding general, feel very distressed. He rode up to Agador Dorji with a face full of anger. He wanted to ask why Agador Dorji did not bring the 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen when they clearly had the opportunity to win. Not only did they miss the opportunity to win, but they also lost so many brave warriors. Suhi had just appeared, but before he could say anything, Agador Dorji spoke first. "How was it? I said that we should focus on probing. You must have seen that the enemy's musketeers were arranged in the southern forest. They are the biggest threat. If we don't get rid of them, the more cavalrymen we send, the greater our losses will be. Sigh, speaking of which, we still underestimated the enemy. Fortunately, the enemy's forces are limited. This time, they also suffered a lot of casualties. If they want to face our attack again, they will need to send more troops. This way, our other two routes will have a chance." As if talking to himself, Agador Dorji made a post-battle conclusion by answering his own questions. He actually forced Suhi to not say a word. He originally wanted to criticize and complain, but he found that he no longer had the chance. This was because there was a trace of killing intent in Agador Dorji's eyes. He dared to guarantee that if he questioned his lord's words, he would be stripped of his military power. It was even possible that he would become a prisoner. Agador Dorji was an extremely selfish person. In order to achieve his goals, he was often unscrupulous. The fact that he was able to get away from his elder brother without falling out with him proved everything. When dealing with such a person, it was absolutely impossible to use common sense to reason with him. Knowing this, Suhi wisely shut his mouth. His original questioning tone also changed to asking for medicine. Facing Suhi's understanding, Agador Dorji was naturally very happy. He readily agreed to transfer the medical supplies in the army to treat the enemy's cavalrymen. As for the result of the previous defeat, both sides tacitly agreed not to mention it. It was as if it had never happened. Compared to the Tatar cavalrymen, the mercenaries' morale was indeed high, and the situation was gratifying. In one battle, they killed more than 2,800 cavalrymen and captured more than 1,000 enemy soldiers. More than 500 of the mercenaries' cavalrymen died, and more than 800 were injured. The main reason was that the Jurchen cavalry suffered heavy losses. Most of the people who died were killed when the enemy first shot arrows at them. Arrange for the injured soldiers to be treated immediately. We can't let a tragic thing happen where people don't die on the battlefield and end up dying from injuries. Yang Chendong rode on the White Dragon horse and said to the logistics battalion commander, "Young heir, young master, please rest assured. Our logistics battalion has recently transferred 300 people to practice their medical skills. It has been quite effective." As the battalion commander, Beta Persei patted his chest and said, "Very good. Clean up the battlefield. Take the captured horses and prisoners back to the first city. Let the people there see that the so-called elite Tatar cavalry is not invincible. Anyone who chooses to be the enemy of our mercenaries will make the biggest mistake of their life." Yang Chendong nodded, then reached out and patted Beta Persei's shoulder. "If the medical officer has extra, treat the injuries of these Tatar cavalrymen. Maybe they will join our camp in the future." "Yes, I will do my best." Beta Persei nodded in agreement. If it was someone else who said that to treat the injuries of the original enemy, he would definitely explode. But these words came from the sixth young master, so of course he would not object. But from the words "do your best," it could be seen that he still had some emotions. After quickly dealing with the post-war matters, Yang Chendong looked to the north and west. He muttered, "The first step of the plan went well. The next step depends on the other two. Let Tiger's Mane come over. It should be time for his independent regiment to show its power." The messenger sent by Agar Dorji delivered the news of the battle in the southern forest in a timely manner. When the news came out, it was already a little out of shape. It was probably because the Tatar cavalry had won a great victory in the battle in the southern forest, which put a lot of pressure on the mercenaries. Next, they would definitely transfer troops to assist the southern forest. Then, it was time for them to seize the opportunity. The first to arrive will be rewarded with 10,000 taels of silver. "Haha, good," Haraluaku said with a laugh. Then, when Du looked at the other side of the West River, there was a look of desire in his eyes. Unlike Agar Dorji, Haraluaku was the kind of newborn calf that was not afraid of tigers. Since young, he had been shrouded in his father's halo. In addition, when he was born, his appearance was not obvious and was even a little ugly. This made him want to prove himself more than others. Now that he finally had the opportunity to lead an army alone, and the situation seemed to be very beneficial to him, he began to think about how to make contributions and show off his skills. He even wanted to use his efforts to tell everyone that he was not only Agar Dorji's son, but also a general who could fight well. Of course, Haraluaku was not a hot-headed person. He still decided to see the enemy retreat first, then look for an opportunity to fight. And just as he was looking forward to it, on that night, the camp that was originally lit with torches suddenly became restless. Then, from afar, he could see the enemy troops leaving with torches. Chapter 7:11. Young Master, the enemy really did withdraw their troops. The scout who was ordered to keep an eye on the enemy's situation excitedly opened the door of the tent to report. This caused Haraluo, who had just fallen asleep, to immediately crawl out from under his blankets. "Quickly bring me out to take a look." As soon as he fell asleep, Haraluo dreamt of himself charging across the West River, beating back the mercenaries and arriving at Beginning City. Who would have thought that the dream would come true so quickly? Following the scout, they arrived at the West River. What they saw was the scene of the enemy's torch squad leaving one after another. Although there weren't many torches, the remaining ones moved very frequently. In a short while, he saw 4 to 5 groups of torches leaving the camp. Haraluo made a rough calculation in his heart and revealed a meaningful smile. "These mercenaries are very careful. Do they think that I won't be able to detect their movements if they don't leave in large numbers? Humph. You underestimate the heroes of the world too much." Seeing that the mercenaries were using small groups to cover the retreat of the main army, Haraluo was even more certain that the enemy had sent reinforcements to the southern forest. After making up his mind, Haraluo said to the scout beside him, "Pass down my orders. The soldiers will wake up at 4 in the morning and eat at 5 in the morning. After that, the entire army will cross the river. This time, we must be the first army to reach Beginning City." Young master is wise. The scout who had the same idea didn't forget to flatter him. This caused Haraluo to laugh even more loudly. After returning to the tent, Haraluo didn't feel sleepy anymore. He just sat there and waited for the arrival of dawn. After a long time of shouting and cheering, the sky gradually brightened. While the morning fog still lingered on the West River, making it impossible to see the situation on the other side clearly, the 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry had already finished their breakfast. They boarded the wooden rafts that had been prepared earlier and left across the river. Perhaps it was because of the mist on the river, or perhaps the enemy had really retreated. The 5,000 Tatar cavalry actually arrived on the other side of the West River without any obstruction. As soon as they arrived, Haraluo loudly announced the order to attack. He wanted to take advantage of the fact that the enemy wasn't ready to launch a surprise attack and obtain victory. Once the order was given, the 5,000 Tatar cavalry mounted their horses and brandished their swords, charging straight toward the mercenary camp 3 miles away. His shouts could be heard from far away, drifting along with the wind. What was surprising was that there was no movement from the opposite side of the barracks despite all the shouting. This was very illogical. Whether they were panicking or going out of the camp to fight, there had to be a plan. This kind of disregard was really a little strange. Haliruo's face was filled with doubt as he charged at the front of the group. However, a thought quickly surfaced in his mind. The mercenaries must have escaped under the cover of the night. Perhaps they knew that the southern Sinewood forest could not be defended, so they had already retreated to the Beginning City. If that was the case, then he would lead the large army straight in and charge to the Beginning City. The first merit would undoubtedly belong to him. Ha ha. Thinking of this, Halaruo laughed heartily. His 5,000 Tatar cavalry had already arrived in front of the camp. As expected, there was still no movement. From the looks of it, there was no one inside. Many of the Tatar cavalrymen, who were originally nervous, had relaxed expressions on their faces. Search and see if there is anything valuable left behind. After all, this was an abandoned camp. Just the tents left behind were worth some silver taels. The Tatar cavalry eyed the tents covetously as they dismounted and charged into the tents. Some of the Tatar cavalry took the initiative to stand guard. It had to be said that elites were elites. Even with a great victory at hand, they were still able to maintain a calm formation. It was precisely because these people abided by the rules of war that they were able to escape this disaster. On the other hand, the Tatar cavalry who were eager to obtain the spoils of war had already been locked onto by the god of death the moment they charged into the green tents. Boom! Without any warning, a huge explosion suddenly sounded from a tent. A Tatar horseman who had entered the tent, as well as 5 horsemen standing outside, were immediately sent flying into the air by the powerful explosion. And all of this was only the beginning. It was like a chain reaction, like dominoes being pushed down by someone. Explosions sounded one after another at this moment. The nearby military tents also began to explode continuously at this moment. Those who had entered the tent, those who hadn't entered but had already walked to the front of the tent, as well as some Tatar cavalrymen who were staring at the tent, had all become targets. Amidst the continuous sounds of explosions, these people were engulfed in a sea of fire. What's going on? The continuous explosions shattered Hilario's eardrums, but as the commander, he still didn't forget to shout out loud. Even though his voice wasn't even worth mentioning in front of the powerful explosions, and no one could hear him clearly, he still continued to shout out loud. It was destined that no one would answer his question. There was only the continuous explosions and the sudden sounds of killing. At the moment of the explosion, a group of over 5,000 cavalrymen had already surrounded the area. Firearms appeared in the hands of these cavalrymen. They were the main force of the independent regiment that had retreated to this place and returned. Apart from the 2 firearms battalions that were left behind in the southern forest, the remaining 14 independent battalions were all gathered here. The instant the booby traps were detonated, they rushed out as planned, quickly surrounding the panicked and disorderly Tatar cavalry. The greatest damage caused by the explosions wasn't the psychological pressure on the Tatar cavalry, but rather the deterrence of the warhorses. What animals feared the most was fire and powerful sound waves. The exploding mines seemed to have both of these. The warhorses that hadn't experienced such a situation were naturally afraid from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, they instinctively neighed, jumped, and even ran wildly without knowing where to go. It seemed that only by doing so could they relax a little. The usually obedient warhorses suddenly jumped crazily, completely disobeying orders. Many unprepared Tatar cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. Even some of the cavalrymen with good riding skills could only lie on their horses to prevent themselves from being thrown off. It was completely impossible for them to command the warhorses. At this time, the mercenaries appeared. While they were still far away, the bullets of their firearms whistled through the air. One shot after another hit the uncontrolled and unprepared Tatar cavalrymen. Blood splattered everywhere. One by one, the cavalrymen were shot in the chest or body. They fell off their horses or directly fell to the ground, ending their young lives. Enemy attack, counterattack, prepare to counterattack. The sudden situation in front of him caused a short circuit in Hilario's mind. Then, as if he was suddenly awakened, he began to shout loudly. However, he only managed to shout twice before he was thrown off the back of the horse by the frenzied horse. The intense pain caused him to fall to the ground, unable to make a sound for a long time. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people who suffered the same fate as Hilario, but at least a few hundred cavalrymen. The rest of the Tatar cavalry were either injured from being thrown off their horses, or were still fighting against their horses. Some were even killed by the mercenaries' long-range muskets. There were less than 1,000 Tatar cavalrymen who were able to maintain a certain level of fighting strength. However, these 1,000 cavalrymen were already scared out of their wits. When they saw the sudden change in the army, they pulled out their sabers. However, when they saw the number of mercenaries around them, some of the smarter ones obediently put down their sabers, dismounted, and surrendered. Even their commander didn't make a sound of resistance. The other party used firearms that could easily take a person's life from hundreds of feet away. Their morale was inferior, their numbers were inferior, and their weapons were inferior as well. How could they fight this battle? The most precious thing to a person was their life. If they surrendered, they would live. If they resisted, they would die. Their deaths were worthless. As long as they weren't fools, they would know how to make the choice. A total of 14 battalions of independent soldiers charged over like wolves and tigers. They either raised their Type 81 rifles or held their longbows. There were even some who held horse lashings. Step by step, they closed in on the enemy. In the eyes of these soldiers, killing intent was overflowing. If anyone wanted to continue resisting, they wouldn't mind silencing them. It was precisely this kind of aura that caused the Tatar cavalrymen who originally wanted to resist to become extremely obedient. After all, no one was willing to joke around with their lives, especially when there was a surging river behind them. With nowhere else to go, it seemed that surrendering was the only way to survive. As they continued to advance, they continued to capture captives. The 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen had completely lost their morale under the sudden attack of a booby trap. When their commander, Harichu, was knocked unconscious by his warhorse, they became people without a leader. They were successfully incorporated into the independent regiment. One by one, they threw down their sabers, jumped off their war horses, and surrendered. The pitiful Harichu was tied up tightly while he was still unconscious. His identity was even betrayed by his subordinates, and he became the target of Tiger's Main's care. Vice Commander Xian, look after these people. Bring them all back to New City. This person needs to be taken care of. I'm afraid that he will come in handy in the upcoming battle. Pointing at the still unconscious Harichu, Tiger's Mane laughed heartily. He then led the 10 soldiers of the independent regiment away from the Shi River and headed towards the north slope. Chapter 7:12. North Slope. General Gu Lang, who had also received Agar Dorji's message, was in high spirits. As a general who had rendered meritorious service, he wanted to obtain military merits more than anyone else. However, the North Slope was difficult to attack, so he was unable to fulfill his ambition. Now, Lord Gulang said that the battle in the southern forest was going smoothly. After the battle, many mercenaries were eliminated. In order to defend there, it was very likely that they would transfer troops from other places to the southern forest. In this way, Gulang's opportunity had appeared. The so-called 10,000 taels of silver for being the first to attack the beginning city did not excite Glenn. He was more interested in this first contribution. This was also a good opportunity for him to wash away his shame. Therefore, after he received the news, he had been sending people to watch every move of the mercenaries on the north slope. However, the more anxious he was, the more there was no news. Half an afternoon and a night passed, but there were still no clues. Just when Gulang was a little impatient and was thinking about whether to send people to ask Lord Gulang again, the scout finally sent news that the mercenaries on the north slope were moving. They seemed to be changing their guard. A large number of people were moving, but because of the terrain, they could not see clearly what was happening. They must have received orders to send reinforcements to the battlefield in the southern forest. After the scout finished reporting the news, Gulang was excited and made some arbitrary conclusions. General, if that's the case, why don't we attack now and attract the enemy here? This is equivalent to giving Lord Gulang more opportunities. The scout misunderstood and asked, "There's no need for that." Gulang immediately shook his head. This was an opportunity for him to perform meritorious service. How could he give it to others? Therefore, while shaking his head, he said aloud, "Lord Gulang has already sent an order for us to find a way to rush to the beginning city. This is the greatest support for Lord Gulang, understand?" "Understood, General," the scout replied as if he had understood the situation. After convincing the scout, Gulang said with a slightly excited expression, "How about this? You find a way to get as close to the enemy as possible and watch their movements. Once you find that they have finished deploying their troops, inform me. Then, prepare the entire army and launch a fierce attack in 2 hours." Gulang still had some brains. He did not attack immediately because he wanted to create an opportunity for the other party to divide their forces. Only in this way could he seize the opportunity to make contributions and rush to the beginning city. His goal was to directly rush into the city. By then, the mercenaries would no longer have a base behind them. With a pincer attack, it would be the time to destroy the mercenaries. If he could really do this, Gulang would have defeated the war god of the great Ming dynasty. As a result, his name would resound throughout the entire grassland. At that time, who would dare to look down on him? At that time, he would be able to raise his voice even in front of Lord Agar Dorj. Glenn was very excited and looked forward to the future. However, he did not know that the mercenaries on the north slope were not really splitting up. They were just faking it. They had even dug a large enough pit to trap horses on the top of the slope, and had even joined forces with the Tiger's Main independent regiment that had rushed over from the West River. They were just waiting for him to attack, and then they would give him a head-on blow and take him down in one fell swoop. This was originally one of Yang Chindong's plans. First, he would engage in a battle with the main force of the Tatar army on the battlefield that was most suitable for cavalry charges. In order to show the enemy that he was weak, he deliberately lowered the power of the continuous fire guns. This was to make Agar Dorj underestimate the enemy and think that he would definitely mobilize troops from the other 2 places in order to defend the southern forest. Once this news spread to the West River and the North Slope, they would fall into the trap and send out troops. In this way, he could gather the superior forces to launch a counterattack and achieve his goal of defeating them one by one. In this way, he could gather the main force of the Tatar army again and achieve his goal of defeating them in one battle. Gulang, who did not know about this, was eager to make contributions. When he heard that the mercenaries on the top of the slope might have split up, he looked for an opportunity to kill his way up. Only half an hour after he received the news, the mercenaries who rushed to support the southern forest should have gone far away and would not be back for a while. The Tatar cavalry under the slope had begun to attack. Although it was said to be a slope, it was not very urgent. It was just that the slope was longer and was not suitable for the cavalry to charge. However, if the cavalry worked hard, they would still be able to charge up. It was just that they would need more time. This time, it was no longer a probing attack. The first charge was to send out 2,000 cavalry as the vanguard. Different from the previous two charges, these 2,000 cavalry were only met with sporadic resistance and had already charged halfway up the slope. Looking at the top of the slope, there were only a few hundred mercenaries who were giving out bows and arrows. Haha, as expected. Seeing that the front army was progressing so smoothly, Gulang laughed endlessly. He finally gave the order for the entire army to attack. Immediately, 10,000 Tatar cavalry loudly shouted and charged up the slope from the bottom of the mountain. On the top of the slope, the independent regiment's commander Tiger, Ming, and the cavalry reinforced regiment's commander Windchaser used binoculars to stare at the Tatar cavalry under the slope. The two of them revealed a look of disbelief. What a good-for-nothing. Even if it is a charge, it should not be so fast. Windchaser shook his head and put down the binoculars in his hand. He sighed and said, "Haha, good for a good-for-nothing. Our plan can be carried out even more smoothly. We can go support the southern forest even faster. The young master has been waiting for our good news." Tiger, Ming also put down the binoculars in his hand. Then he reached for his waist and took out a 54 handgun. It was the basic equipment for mercenary officers and above. It was also a symbol of status. With Tiger Ming's status, he had already been equipped with this kind of high-level weapon. Now that he took it out, he was preparing to launch a counterattack. Windchaser also took out a 54 handgun from his waist. Then he carefully wiped it again and again. When the entire body of the gun was wiped until it seemed like it was reflecting light, he opened the safety and aimed it at the top of the slope. This time, he also wanted to have fun with a handgun. Seeing Windchaser's excited appearance, Tiger, Ming smiled and kindly reminded him, "Commander Windchaser, a handgun is not like a spear. The shooting distance is limited. If it is too far, it won't have any effect." I know. Windchaser repeatedly nodded. However, it could be seen that Windchaser was still a bit nervous. It was just like the first time he held a blade and rode on a horse. The two commanders only hid and didn't move. The other mercenaries also waited in their positions. Just like this, the Tatar cavalry charged halfway up the slope and into their line of sight. Dengyu, who was in charge of luring the enemy, looked like he was going all out to stop the advance of the Tatar cavalry. However, it was obvious that because of the small number of people, he was powerless. Seeing the enemy rushing up, he immediately panicked and shouted to retreat. Immediately, hundreds of cavalry turned around and fled. That clean and neat appearance attracted bursts of laughter from the Tatar cavalry behind. Under the laughter, Gulang also rushed to the top of the slope with the main cavalry. He also saw the scene of Dengyu leading the cavalry to retreat. Haha, good. Now we have successfully reached the top of the slope. Next, it is time for us to make a contribution. Boys, charge together with this general. The first to reach the beginning city will be rewarded with 100 silver taels. After Gulang shouted to boost the morale, the Tatar cavalry in front of him shouted excitedly. Then they rushed forward crazily. They wanted to follow behind Dengyu to see if they could kill the enemy in the process of chasing. At the same time, they also wanted to get closer to the beginning city. In this way, Dengyu ran in front. Behind him, there were tens of thousands of Tatar cavalry waving their sabers. From time to time, there would be people shooting arrows. Although the distance was still far and it was impossible to shoot, It did have a big deterrent effect. Deng Yu, who was running in front, looked back from time to time. When he saw that the Tatar cavalry had indeed fallen into the trap and caught up with him, the corner of his eyes showed a trace of a proud smile. He looked back and saw the inconspicuous road sign on the side of the road. He said loudly to the cavalry warriors beside him, "We will soon reach the horse trap area." Everyone split up according to the plan. The mercenary cavalry who had been informed in advance of the trap immediately split into two sides, leaving the dangerous area and continuing to run forward. Some of the Tatar cavalry who were less than a mile behind also noticed this scene, but they didn't take it to heart. In their opinion, the enemy was probably in a panic and didn't know where to go. Since that was the case, they would just chase after them. Perhaps they were eager to make a contribution, perhaps they were impatient and careless, or perhaps they were arrogant and underestimated the enemy. In short, the Tatar cavalry broke into the horse trap that the mercenaries had already dug. Previously, they had considered the large number of enemies, so when the horse trap was dug, the scale was very large. It was more than 30 meters wide and 3 miles long. It consumed a lot of manpower and material resources, and now it could finally be put to use. Without any surprise, the Tatar cavalry fell into the trap. Before the first row of cavalry realized what was going on, their warhorses' heads sank and they fell into the 4-meter-deep pit. This was only the beginning. More and more Tatar cavalry fell into the pit like dumplings. They were advancing dauntlessly, wave after wave, and there was no break in between. One after another, more than half of the 2,000 vanguard cavalry fell into the pit. This finally attracted the attention of the other cavalry behind them. More and more Tatar cavalry pulled on the reins of their warhorses and stopped in place. "What's going on?" General Glenn rushed over under the protection of a group of soldiers. When he saw the scene in front of him, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. More than 1,000 cavalry fell into the pit, and most of them were injured because of the trampling of their warhorses. Some of them were even covered in blood and died. Chapter 7:13. Bastards! Damn mercenaries! Seeing that he had lost more than 10% of his troops, Glenn was naturally furious. When he raised his head to look at the mercenaries who were still retreating along the path, he said angrily, "Chase, continue to chase after them. They don't have any more tricks up their sleeves. I want to catch them and tear them into pieces." In Glenn's view, this was clearly the last resort of the mercenaries. This also proved that the other party had no other tricks up their sleeves. Otherwise, how could they set up such a big trap? It was too late, and they didn't have time to rescue the cavalry who fell into the pit. After asking them to think of a way to save themselves, Glenn led most of the cavalry and continued to pursue the enemy. For safety reasons, he deliberately sent a cavalry team of 100 people to walk in front to prevent the appearance of traps. Obviously, this kind of worry was unnecessary. Large-scale horse traps required a lot of manpower and resources. Even if the mercenaries had individual shovels in their hands, it would be much easier to dig them out. However, such a large-scale trap with a wide area was not something that could be easily dug out. After chasing for another 3 miles, they were still very safe. This also made the Tatar cavalry, who was originally nervous, began to feel relieved. They began to speed up. Glenn, who was walking in the team, thought that at this speed, they should be able to reach the beginning city around noon. Disaster always came when there was the most hope, just like the darkness before dawn. Just when the Tatar cavalry thought that they saw hope and discovered that the distance between them and the mercenaries was shortened from 1 mile to less than 300 meters, suddenly, a loud gunshot broke the previous silence. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding in the grass on both sides of the road, opened fire. With the help of the half-meter-tall grass, he fired the first shot and hit a centurion who was shouting to urge the cavalry to move forward. The gunshot was an order. This shot led Windchaser to fire a shot as well. It was a pity that he still needed to practice his marksmanship. Although the distance was less than 40 meters, this shot still missed and didn't hurt anyone. But it didn't matter. After this shot, it attracted the attention of the 4 independent battalions who were lying in ambush at the same time. They were the only firearm battalion other than the 2 Southern Forest battalions. The 4 battalions had a total of 1,600 men. Gunshots rang out in unison, and in just one wave, they killed the 1,000 Tatar cavalry charging at the front. When the Tatar cavalrymen were killed one after another, the entire Tatar cavalrymen were shocked and panicked. At this moment, along with the second wave of gunfire, the mercenaries who were fleeing stopped in their tracks. Not only that, but thousands of cavalrymen also appeared beside them. They brandished their sabers or held bows and arrows as they charged towards them. The arrogant Tatar cavalry was stunned by the sudden change in front of them. They watched as their companions were killed one by one on their horses. When they saw the cavalry getting closer and closer, many arrows were already falling in front of them. Some of their companions were even injured. They began to feel fear. The vanguard cavalry was killed by spears or arrows one by one. They were unable to exert enough fighting power. It was like a fist being held down by someone. When they were unable to kill the enemy, the strength of the Tatar cavalry was suppressed to the greatest extent. They could only passively take a beating. Don't panic. The warriors in front will attack the enemy with your sabers. The warriors in the back will be ready to attack. Seeing that the situation wasn't good, Gulang yelled. He knew that he had fallen into the enemy's trap, but at this moment, he didn't have a better solution. If he retreated now, he might not have the chance to make a comeback. So, he could only endure. The shout of the commander calmed down some of the Tatar cavalrymen. Some of them brandished their sabers and charged forward, while others held their bows and arrows ready to counterattack. After all, they had lived on horseback since they were young. Although there was an unknown change in the situation, their good psychological quality allowed them to quickly calm down. Throw grenades and break the enemy's formation. Prepare the bazookas and break their psychological defense. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding on the side of the road, was also shocked by the Tatar cavalrymen's fighting spirit. Fortunately, he still had a backup plan that could break the enemy's psychological defense. Under the order, some of the soldiers of the independent regiment took out the weapons they had prepared for a long time from their backs or waists. Tiger's Mane specifically asked them to stay behind when the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division left. There were still a lot of grenades, and although there weren't many bazookas, it was still enough to deter the enemy. When these heavy weapons were taken out and activated, countless grenades were thrown at the Tatar cavalrymen like rain. There were also 2 bazookas loaded with shells and began to fire. The situation on the battlefield instantly became very tense. Boom, 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 boom. First, there was a series of loud bangs from the grenades. They smashed a huge hole in the Tatar cavalry, causing countless warhorses to lose their composure amidst their neighs. They no longer listened to the orders of the cavalrymen and danced wildly. 2 rocket launchers were launched to completely suppress the Tatar cavalry's charge. When one of the rocket launchers landed 200 meters away in the enemy's main camp, the fighting spirit that had just been gathered due to Gulang's words suffered a heavy blow in an instant. Under the roar of the bazooka, the cavalrymen were completely stunned by the scene of flames and debris flying in the air. They had never seen such a situation before and didn't know how to deal with it. The warhorses under them became the fuse that led to their final defeat. The warhorses were terrified and ran for their lives. They didn't care about the feelings of their masters and didn't listen to any of their orders. It was a mess, a complete mess. In the chaos, horses bumped into each other and people bumped into each other. Before the mercenary cavalrymen rushed to the front, the Tatar cavalrymen had already fallen into the process of killing each other. One after another, the cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. One after another, the warhorses crashed into each other and fell to the ground. This time, Gulang wasn't spared. After all, when the warhorse went crazy, he didn't care if it was an ordinary soldier or a general who commanded thousands of troops. Under extreme fear, they only knew how to instinctively run and crash in all directions. Before Gulang could continue to issue orders, he was thrown to the ground by the warhorse. Then, he was unlucky enough to be trampled by another warhorse that came out of nowhere. A weight of more than 1,000 kilograms pressed down on his body, causing Glenn to involuntarily open his mouth and widen his eyes. A series of crisp sounds rang in his ears. It was the sound of his ribs being crushed. Pfff. A mouthful of blood spurted out from Gulang's mouth without warning. When the warhorse finally trampled over him, he was unfortunately trampled by another warhorse from afar. Under the continuous trampling, the only thing Gu Lang could do was to keep coughing up blood. Then, the strength in his body started to disappear. At the same time, the blood in his body and the strength in his breath also disappeared. In such a chaotic world, Gu Lang reluctantly closed his eyes and breathed his last breath. Gu Lang was dead. With the death of their general, the soldiers under him lost their commander, and the formation became even more chaotic. In addition, there were more than one or two Tatar cavalrymen who suffered the same fate as Glenn. When the number of Tatar cavalrymen gradually grew to a certain scale, their will to resist was completely worn away. The remaining Tatar cavalrymen only wanted to escape from this purgatory of the human world. They had no other thoughts. Charge, kill, dismount, and throw your swords. Those who surrender will not be killed. At this moment, a large number of mercenary cavalry arrived. Taking advantage of this unstoppable momentum and chaos, they slaughtered their way into the chaotic Tatar cavalry as if they were in a no-man's land. Raising their swords, they chopped down one enemy after another under their horses. Under the strong morale, many of the defeated Tatar cavalrymen chose to surrender. After all, knowing that they would die if they resisted, it was not bravery but foolishness. 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen suffered heavy losses, especially under the attacks of muskets, grenades, and rocket launchers. Their will to fight was disintegrated. In the end, they abandoned their remaining will to fight and their dignity. They became defeated soldiers and captives. Tiger Edge let out a long sigh and stood up from the grass. He then looked at Wind Chaser, who had an equally excited expression, and said, "Let's hurry up. The young master is still waiting for us to reinforce and regroup." Okay. Windchaser also knew that they were able to obtain victory here because of the support of the independent firearms unit. Since they had won, what they needed to do now was to rush to the southern forest with the fastest speed and meet up with the 6th young master to annihilate the last of the Tatar cavalrymen. Come, hurry up and clean up the battlefield. If anyone doesn't surrender, kill them. Don't waste time. The will to fight had been defeated, so the next step was much easier. Clean up the battlefield and capture the captives. Windchaser had already given the order. The soldiers under him still wanted to go to the southern forest and continue to make contributions. In their impatience, whenever they encountered a Tatar cavalryman who showed resistance or didn't surrender, they would kill them without saying anything. It was precisely because of such cruel actions that the Tatar cavalry became afraid. These mercenaries really didn't take human lives seriously. When they saw someone coming over to persuade them to surrender, they didn't dare to hesitate and threw down their swords and dismounted from their horses. 10,000 cavalrymen, 3,000 died, 2,000 were injured, and 5,000 were captured. And to complete these actions, it only took them 2 hours. It could be said that they were very fast. Send 1,000 cavalrymen and a battalion of firearmed soldiers to transport the captives and the wounded back to the beginning city. The rest of you, follow me to the southern forest. Hurry. Seeing that the situation was settled, Tiger's Mane's voice was slightly anxious. He was really worried about the young master's safety. Chapter 7:14. Southern Forest. Since the morning, Agador had issued a decision to send out a small group of cavalry to provoke the enemy. According to Agador, what they had to do now was to constantly put pressure on the mercenaries on the opposite side, forcing them to withdraw their troops from the West River and the North Slope battlefield, creating an opportunity for the Tatar cavalry to advance. In this regard, General Suhi expressed a different opinion. In his opinion, since they already knew the strength of the enemy's army, what they should do now was to immediately launch a decisive battle and rely on their advantage in numbers to severely injure the enemy, instead of launching a probing attack to give the enemy more time to prepare. General Su, you have seen the strength of the mercenaries, especially their firearms, which can be said to be accurate and long-range. Do you think that if we fight head-on, there will be a winner in the end? Injuring the enemy and losing 800 of our own men is not what I want. I have never thought of swallowing the mercenaries. To be honest, we don't have that big of an appetite. Our goal is to drive them away and occupy the beginning city. So, don't ask for a battle. Let's focus on the overall situation. After seeing Suhi ask for a battle several times in a row, Agador finally lost his patience and said this somewhat angrily. Seeing that Agador had made up his mind, Suhi could do nothing but feel heartache. Walking out of the military camp, he looked up at the sky helplessly and then said sadly, "God wants me to die." Compared with Agar Dorji's so-called view of the overall situation, in Suhi's view, it was just a manifestation of timidity. It was because this person was afraid of death, afraid that the army would be severely damaged, and afraid that his own strength would be damaged, so he placed his hopes on the other two routes. But in fact, whether it was Haraluaku or Glenn, Suhi did not think highly of them. Of these two, one was born as a son of a rich family, and the other was a general of a defeated army. Both of them belonged to the kind of people who had no strategy. It was simply self-deceiving and extremely unrealistic and irresponsible to put the hope of victory on them. It was just that Agador believed too much in the saying that numbers could defeat everything. He didn't listen to her advice at all, which made Suhi feel helpless. The only thing he could do was to watch small troops step forward and serve as whetstones for the mercenaries. That's right, when the mercenaries faced the Tatar cavalry, they did not choose to charge with their entire army. Instead, they chose to send small groups to harass the Tatar cavalry. After dispatching the main force of the independent regiment, Yang Chendong was left with less than 5,000 cavalry. Facing more than 10,000 Tatar cavalry, unless he was willing to take out all the firearms in his warehouse, it would be extremely difficult for him to win. Even Yang Chendong was prepared for the worst. If he couldn't hold on, he would slowly retreat and use the cooperation of the two gun battalions to exchange space for time. As long as the enemies at the West River and the North Slope were dealt with, he would have more troops to deploy. At that time, it would be time for him to launch an all-out counterattack. Unexpectedly, the other party seemed to know what he was thinking and cooperated with him. They did not choose to charge with their entire army, but instead sent small groups to harass the enemy. This was exactly what he wanted. After discussing with the two regimental commanders, Yella and Lujua, he decided to send a small group of cavalry to confront the enemy head-on and treat it as actual combat training. It was true that Agador brought elite Tatar cavalry, but the strength of the mercenaries was not bad either. In particular, their training was several times better than the other forces. It could be said that the combat strength of the cavalry was increasing every day. In addition, their cavalry sabers were sharp and tough, which increased their chances of winning by a bit. Now that the other party wanted to fight with fewer people, of course they would help. In this way, the other side would send out a few hundred people, and the other side would send out a few hundred people. Both sides began a cavalry charge outside the vast southern forest. A cavalry charge focused on morale and proficiency in horsemanship. One had to know how to use the warhorse as a part of one's body and control it flexibly. Of course, the sharpness of the weapon also played a large role. In terms of morale, there was nothing to say about the mercenaries. Yang Chendong, who did not lack money, gave them high rewards in terms of money. Not only that, but being a soldier under him also gave them a good social status. Not only would a soldier bring glory to his family, but he could also feed his family. Their horsemanship had also improved under hard training. Even if they could not compare to the elites of the Mongol cavalry, normal cavalry would not be a match for them. Furthermore, the cavalry swords were made by the Chimeric City Munitions Factory, so the materials used were abundant. Its sharpness and toughness were unparalleled, which made up for some of the shortcomings in horsemanship. They had high morale, excellent horsemanship, and excellent weapons. In a true battle of 100 cavalry against 100 cavalry, the mercenary cavalry would not be afraid of anyone. This was especially so when they had the 3-to-3 tactic. Although it was not as effective as on land, it was enough to increase their combat strength. All in all, in a cavalry charge with equal numbers, the mercenaries were not afraid of anyone. Even if the opponent was the Tatar cavalry and the elites of the Tatar cavalry, the outcome would be the same. This was evident from the 3 consecutive battles. In the first battle, they killed 60 enemy cavalry and lost 40 of their own. In the second battle, they killed 70 enemy cavalry and lost 43 of their own. In the third battle, they killed 55 enemy cavalry and lost 45 of their own. The first and second battles were fought by the Nuzen cavalry. In the third battle, it was Luge's 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Just from the results of the battle, the Nuzen cavalry was indeed very powerful, worthy of their name. Of course, this result had a lot to do with the cavalry swords in their hands. In the end, the results were mostly because the enemy's cavalry swords were broken and could not fight anymore. After 3 consecutive battles, the mercenaries' morale was even higher. On the other hand, the Tatar cavalry were not in a good situation. General Suhi's face was even gloomier. She thought that the previous defeat was because the other side used guns and had good tactical cooperation. She was defeated by the combination of inside and outside. But now, it seemed that there was no need for tactics. With the same number of soldiers, they were no match for the enemy. This made him have another thought. Was it a mistake to choose to be the enemy of the mercenaries this time? The Tatar cavalry needed to find a new base because of the lack of provisions, but did it have to be the beginning city? But it was obviously too late to say this now. The war had already begun, and it was no longer a situation where one side could retreat as they wished. For example, if they ordered a retreat now, it would be a great blow to the Tatar cavalry's morale. If the mercenaries chased after them at this time, it was likely to lead to a one-sided battle. If that was the case, they would lose without a fight. Feeling that if the battle continued like this, even if there was good news from the West River and the North Slope, the morale of the troops would still be damaged. Suhi once again walked into the tent of Commander-in-Chief Agar Dorj and put forward his request. That was, they could not continue fighting. Sir, we can't continue fighting. After 3 battles, we have lost. The morale of the troops has begun to become unstable, Suhi said with a worried face. Yes, Agar Dorj, who was sitting at the head of the tent, replied absent-mindedly. Sir, what are you thinking about? Seeing that Agar Dorj's expression was a little ugly, Suhi asked casually out of concern. It's nothing. It's just that the scouts we sent out suddenly stopped responding. There's also no news from the West River and the North Slope. It's been almost a day. Do you think there's a problem? Agar Dorj hesitated for a moment, but considering that Suhi was his general, there were some things that he should not hide from him. So, he carefully told him what had happened. What? Originally, Suhi thought that Agar Dorj was too tired from the battle and had some problems with his body. However, when he heard this question, his jaw dropped in shock. The scouts' communication with the outside world had been cut off. What did this mean? It meant that they had become deaf and blind, which was a taboo in war. When 2 armies fought, although it did not necessarily require one to know the situation of the other side, one should at least know where one's own troops were. But now, they were not even clear about their own situation. What could it be other than a big problem? How long ago did this happen? Suhi felt a strong sense of crisis, and he was even more anxious to know the specific details of the matter. After the battle yesterday afternoon, there was no news from the outside world. At first, I thought that the scouts might have gone to rest because it was dark, but there was still no news until dawn. In the morning, I sent out some more scouts and told them that no matter what happened, they had to report back within 4 hours. But now, it has been 6 hours, and not a single scout has returned. As Agadorji spoke, he looked at Suhi. It seemed that he was asking for her advice and wanted to hear her opinion. It could be seen that Agar Dorj still had a trace of hope in his eyes. Perhaps he was still thinking that the scouts had been delayed by something and that they would return to report to him after a while. Suhi's mind was much calmer than Agar Dorj's. What was a scout? They were the most flexible people in an army. They were all warriors that were picked out of 100. Not only were their individual qualities strong, but their reactions were also very agile. Under normal circumstances, it was rare for a mission to go wrong when it was assigned to them. But now, there was no news from all the scouts that were sent out. There could only be one possibility, and that was that there was a collective problem. In other words, there should have been an inescapable net set up around them long ago, completely enveloping them. Chapter 7:15. That was the only way for such an outcome to occur. In the face of such an obvious problem, Agadorji, as the commander-in-chief, still had a fluke and fantasy mentality. Suhi was so angry that she couldn't say a word. However, this wasn't the time to pursue the matter. Instead, he had to solve the problem. Although there was anger in her heart, Suhi still suppressed the anger in her heart. She tried to say in a calm but anxious tone, "Your Excellency, I'm afraid things are not good now." "How is it not looking good?" Hearing Suhi's analysis, Agar Dorji's heart skipped a beat. "My lord, scouts are the strongest army. Even if they don't complete the mission well, they should still be able to return and report back. But now that they can't even do that, it can only mean that something has happened to them. Not only them, but I'm afraid that young Master Hala and General Gulang aren't in a good situation either." Suhi voiced out his suspicions. "They aren't in a good situation either? That can't be. They have a total of 15,000 cavalrymen, and how many mercenaries do they have? Their main force can't even move in front of us, so how could they have the strength to attack us?" Agar Dorji said with a look of disbelief. "My lord, now is not the time to be thinking about luck. We didn't know how strong the mercenaries are before, but after these 2 days, it's obvious that we underestimated them. Since that's the case, anything is possible. For safety's sake, I suggest that we retreat immediately and meet up with young Master Hala and General Gulang's troops." Suhi didn't dare to take any chances. A commander was walking on a single plank bridge. Being careful was one of the necessary qualities. Retreat now? Is it that serious? Agadorji finally looked at the situation seriously, his expression becoming more and more serious. "Yes," Suhi said in a very positive tone. Previously, they were worried that a sudden retreat would cause unnecessary trouble or even some unnecessary losses. But now, it seemed that there was no other choice but to retreat. It was better than being annihilated one by one. In the face of Suhi's resolute attitude, Agadorji's face finally crumbled. If the situation is as serious as the general says, then we should retreat. However, the arrangements will depend on the general's plan." "All right, I'll arrange it now. It's already evening now. I'll immediately arrange for the army to start a fire and prepare a meal. When the sky is completely dark, we'll retreat overnight." Suhi cupped his fists with a solemn expression. "We'll do as you say." Agar Dorji's mind was already in a mess because of these words. He could no longer make any correct judgments and could only listen to his subordinate. Suhi finally left the barracks. As soon as he came out, he took a deep breath and looked at the mercenary camp 5 miles away. He then narrowed his eyes and called a guard and said, "Order the army to start a fire and prepare a meal immediately. Also, arrange for 100 cavalry to challenge the mercenaries." The guard had a puzzled look on his face. Previously, the general was against such a small army fighting. It was no different from sending them to their deaths, and it would be a blow to their morale. Why did the general change his mind in such a short period of time? But since it was the general's order, of course he would obey. After cupping his fists, he turned around and made the arrangements. After watching the guard leave, Suhi looked at the mercenary camp again and murmured, "I underestimated you, but once we leave this time, the next time we come, we will definitely let you know the power of the Tatar cavalry." Mercenary camp. Yang Chendong was resting in the big tent when Beta Persei suddenly entered the tent to report that the Tatars had sent another 100 cavalry to challenge them. "They sent people again?" Yang Chendong raised his head when he heard this. A trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. "Yes, they sent another 100-men team. They are now 2 miles away from our camp and have already set up a formation." Beta Persei nodded and replied, "Then arrange for the 2nd Regiment to send a company of brothers to meet them. Oh, by the way, call Commander Yella and Lujwa to come over for a meeting." After Yang Chendong finished arranging, he instructed again. For some reason, he felt a faint sense of uneasiness in his heart. Beta Persei left, but after a cup of tea, he reappeared. Along with him were the commander of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment, Yella, and the commander of the 2nd Regiment, Lujwa. "Hello, 6th Young Master." As soon as the 2 regimental commanders entered the tent, they were extremely respectful. "You're welcome. Take a seat wherever you like." Beta Persei served the tea. Yang Chendong invited the 2 regimental commanders to sit in front of him with a smile on his face. As soon as the 2 of them sat down, he said, "It's almost dark, and the Tatars have sent troops to challenge us again. What do the 2 of you think?" Originally, The two of them were receiving tea from Beta Persei, but when they suddenly heard this, they were both stunned. Then the two regimental commanders looked at each other and fell into deep thought. Since it was the sixth young master who asked the question, it naturally wouldn't be so simple. Previously, the two of them didn't take this matter seriously. They thought that since the other party had challenged them 3 times in a day, it wouldn't be a big deal if there was a 4th time. But now, they didn't dare to think this way. Those who could become regimental commanders were those who were favored by Yang Chundong in the field of military affairs. They all had some skills, and some of them were even quite capable. Now that they were reminded, the two of them thought for a while and found the problem. Could it be that they're hiding something? Lu Zhuo was the first to speak. Yella followed up and asked, could it be that they're going to make a big move and are using this as a cover? Not only did Yang Chundong ask this question, but the two of them also said this. After thinking about it, they also found something strange. For example, why would they send cavalry to challenge them at such a late hour? For example, they had lost all 3 battles during the day, but why would they want to carry out a 4th battle? Could it be that they had found a way to attack? Just as the two regimental commanders finished speaking, the curtain of the military tent was lifted and the captain of the 1st Guard team, Chiu Vi, walked in. As soon as he came to Yang Chundong's side, he stood at attention and said, reporting to the 6th young master, the 100 Tatar cavalry that came to challenge us this time are the same as before. Also, you asked me to observe the other party's movements. The scout said that the other party is cooking, and the camp looks very busy. That's right. After Yang Chundong heard this, he slapped his thigh and laughed. He felt that something was wrong before, so after Beta Persei went out, he called Chiu Vi and asked him to inquire about these 2 things. The answer to the first thing already proved that the other party didn't have any new methods. In other words, the so-called Tatar cavalry didn't have any new methods to attack. The second thing was to see if there were any changes in the Tatar camp. The conclusion now confirmed a lot of things. It was the end of July, and the days were long and the nights were short. In order to prevent the soldiers from starving at night, meals were served late. Generally, when there was no war, meals wouldn't be served so early. Based on this alone, the Tatar camp's actions could be considered abnormal. What kind of person was Yang Chundong? With an extra lifetime of experience, the things he had seen and heard were far more powerful than the others. Especially his work in his previous life required him to be cautious. Many times, if the slightest problem was not discovered and solved in time, it would lead to irreparable consequences. So in terms of courage and carefulness, no one could compare to him. The sudden challenge from the Tatar cavalry made him vigilant, so it was not surprising. Of course, if Suhi knew that he deliberately sent troops to challenge them in order to show that he was normal, but this kind of behavior was a bit excessive and would attract attention, he wouldn't know whether he should cry or cry. The enemy will definitely make a move. If my guess is correct, they are most likely preparing to retreat. Yang Chundong summarized the 2 pieces of information he just received. It was a bit arbitrary, but also a bit resolute. The enemy is retreating. Hearing the news, Yula and Lu Zhuo were startled, but they quickly nodded. As the saying goes, when things are abnormal, there must be a demon. According to this kind of inference, the 6th young master's words were very reasonable. Since they guessed that the enemy was retreating, the 2 commanders immediately became spirited. 6th young master, we should also immediately make preparations. Let's eat now, and then keep an eye on them. Once we discover that they are retreating, we will chase after them and kill them. We will heavily injure, or even wipe them out. No. To their surprise, Yang Chundong shook his head. Then he smiled and said, we will chase after them, but there is no need to eat. We can inform the soldiers to eat some cold food. In any case, the weather is hot right now, so it doesn't matter. The enemy doesn't want us to guess their intentions, so how can we not cooperate? Ha ha ha. By the way, Tiger's Mane and Windchaser should be rushing over with the army. Let's see where they are now. Yang Chundong's intention was to have a good rest at night and wait until tomorrow morning to launch an all-out counterattack. However, the plan was not as fast as changes. Since the enemy was already vigilant, the timing of the attack would naturally change. Young master, I will go and check. Beta Persei quickly nodded and walked out of the military tent. Yang Chendong was left behind to discuss the pursuit with the two commanders. After a while, Beta Persei walked back. "Young master," I asked the scouts. "They said that Tiger's Mane and Windchaser's Mane are rushing over to me. They should be able to meet us here in 1.5 hours. 1.5 hours. At that time, the sky will be dark. I'm afraid they won't give us that much time," Yang Chendong said thoughtfully. Then he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly got up and came to the sand table. He looked at it very seriously, then pointed to the west of Nanlin and said, "Send scouts to inform Tiger's Mane and Windchaser. Tell them not to come to us directly. Go to the place where the Tatar army retreated and set up an ambush. Tell them that time is limited and they must rush over as fast as possible. We will try to buy them some more time." Beta Persei accepted the order and left. Yang Chendong looked at Yila and Luzhua and said, "You two will have to work hard. Immediately go down and have a mobilization meeting. Remember, don't gather together. Tell the officers below to hold the meeting in a row. In short, don't attract the enemy's attention." Chapter 7:16. Tatar Camp. The cavalry was eating. Su He, who had finished his meal first, walked out of the military tent. A scout came to him and reported in a low voice, "General, there is nothing unusual on the side of the mercenaries." "Okay," Su He replied calmly, and his heart was slightly relieved. This time, they sacrificed another 100-man team to challenge the mercenaries. Presumably, the other party should still be immersed in the joy of victory. They probably wouldn't have thought that they, who had just challenged the mercenaries, were now ready to retreat. Speaking of which, Su He still had another way to go. That was to go all out and fight the mercenaries to the death. It was just that in this way, even if they could win, with the combat power of the mercenaries, they could only win with great difficulty. Without enough strength, even if they occupied the origin city, could they defend it? This was also a problem. In a big battle, they paid a sufficient price, but did not get the corresponding benefits. This was definitely not what Su He wanted, let alone what Agador wanted. In desperation, they had no choice but to retreat. Fortunately, no one would think that they would suddenly retreat when they had the advantage. In this way, once they gathered young Master Hararuo's troops and General Gulang's troops, their strength was still not small. They could still attack and retreat freely. Didn't the Han people have a saying, "Where there is life, there is hope"? As long as they had enough strength, they would not die out in the grassland. At worst, they could go and snatch other people's territories. With the strength of nearly 40,000 cavalry in their hands, how many people could be their opponent? It was a pity that the origin city was not fated to be with them. Thinking of this, Su He still felt a little regretful. In this way, pass down the order. After eating, have a good rest. When the sky is completely dark, we will retreat. Inform all the cavalry that no one can light the torches. Just leave quietly. Since they had decided to leave, there was obviously no need to think about other things. After Su He shook his head vigorously, he instructed the scout beside him. It had to be said that Su He was worthy of being a famous general. He was very careful when doing things. If the opponent this time was not Yang Chendong but someone else, perhaps he would have been deceived by him. The sky gradually darkened, to the point where they had to use torches to see the road under their feet. But from afar, he could still see some shadows, so Su He wanted to wait a little longer. But at this moment, an unexpected thing happened. Suddenly, a scout came to report that the mercenaries had sent a team of 100 cavalrymen to challenge them. "They want to challenge me? It's already so late. Can you still see clearly?" Su He was surprised and puzzled when he heard the news. The scout also had a confused look on his face. He was only responsible for passing on the message. Other things were not for him to consider or question. "All right, since they're here, then let's fight. How about this? Arrange a team of 100 to fight with them. But make sure to tell them that if they can't win, then retreat. There's nothing to be ashamed of. This is also my order." Su He did not want to agree, but if he did not agree, what would he do if the other side was alerted? In the end, he had no choice but to accept the challenge. What Su He didn't know was that this was just Yang Chendong's stalling tactic. He was giving Su He a taste of his own medicine. Right now, he needed time to give Tiger Edge, Windchaser, and the others some time. After thinking about it, sending someone to challenge them now was the best option. If it was a normal day, the Tatar tribe might not agree if they sent people to challenge them at this time. But now, they wanted to escape. As the saying goes, a thief has a guilty conscience. They would definitely accept the challenge. With this in mind, a company of cavalrymen was sent out. Suhi did not think too much about it. In his opinion, the other side clearly wanted to continue showing off their strength. Moreover, he had issued 4 challenges during the day. Wouldn't he allow them to challenge him again? This was a very normal thing. Just like this, when night fell, both sides sent a team of 100 to fight on the prairie. The result was needless to say. Of course, the Tatar cavalrymen were defeated. Compared to the day, this battle was shorter. But even so, the mercenaries were able to gain half an hour of time. This was because even after the battle ended, the victorious mercenaries didn't retreat immediately. Instead, they stood on the spot and cursed for a while. After cursing to their heart's content, they laughed heartily and said that they were going back for dinner and returned happily. The scout came back with news that there were fireworks in the mercenary camp. This made Suhi feel relieved. Since the other side chose to cook at this time, they must not have thought that he would escape. The opportunity finally came. Pass down the order. The army will retreat in order. Leave the torches and tents behind. In order to completely cover up the traces of the retreat, Suhi made a lot of sacrifices. When the sky was completely dark, the Tatar cavalrymen finally began to retreat. Agar Dorj was in the army, and he retreated with the First Army. He left the dangerous task of covering the retreat to General Suhi. Under the cover of the night, the scouts who were lurking within a mile of the Tatar camp saw everything with the help of night vision devices. Seeing that everything was as the 6th young master said, and that the enemy was really retreating overnight, the scouts secretly admired him and immediately sent someone to report the news. The mercenaries who did not hold torches had already mounted their horses, their swords were sheathed, and their bows were on their bodies. The news from the scouts confirmed the 6th young master's guess. There would be a big battle soon, and it would be a chase. All the soldiers were somewhat excited. Yang Chendong was also riding on the white dragon horse. After hearing the exact news from the scout, his expression was also filled with excitement, and he shouted a good word. The enemy had decided to retreat, and now was the time to beat a drowning dog. Yang Chendong pulled out the saber at his waist and loudly said to the 5,000 cavalrymen beside him, "Soldiers, it's time to perform a meritorious service. Pass down my order, pursue, and beat the Tatar cavalrymen." Beat the Tatar cavalrymen. The roar was like a tsunami, followed by the movement of thousands of horses. The torches were lit again and held in their hands. Other than a small number of soldiers who stayed behind to guard the camp, the rest of the cavalry let out a loud roar and all of them patted their horses and madly galloped toward the Tatar camp. The Tatar cavalrymen who were retreating step by step according to the plan suddenly saw countless torches coming from the front. The torches were getting closer and closer, and they panicked for a moment. General Suhi, who was commanding the army, was also shocked by the scene in front of him. His first thought was that his plan had been exposed, and the enemy knew about it. Things are not good. You, and you, follow me. The rest of you, quickly retreat. I will catch up with you later. As expected of Agar Dorji's #1 general, Suhi quickly calmed down and quickly gathered the 3,000 cavalrymen to stay behind to cover the retreat. The situation was too sudden, and it was useless to say anything. At this time, they needed time to retreat. Suhi stepped forward bravely, holding the bow and arrow he often used, and shouted to the 3,000 cavalrymen behind him, "Follow me and use the bow and arrow to counterattack and suppress the enemy's momentum." 3,000 cavalrymen and 3,000 arrows. Under the simultaneous attack, the battle formation was very shocking. At least in Suhi's opinion, it would not be a problem to hold on for a while. The rest of the Tatar army quickly retreated. Suhi led the 3,000 cavalrymen and waited for the mercenaries to come closer. When the first torches were less than 200 meters away, Suhi took the initiative to draw his bow and shouted, "Everyone, follow me and counterattack with the bow and arrow. Fire!" Suddenly, arrows were shot out like rain, heading straight for the mercenaries coming from afar. Wherever they shot, there were torches. This seemed to have become a target marker, allowing everyone to find the direction of their attacks in the dark. Ding ding dang dang. The arrows fell like a dense rain, and from time to time, the torches would suddenly stop and fall to the ground. Under such a dense counterattack of arrows, many of the mercenaries were shot down from their horses. However, there were still more cavalrymen who rushed over. The ones in the lead were the black-armored cavalrymen, who were led by Yang Chendong and more than 100 guards. Taking the lead on the battlefield not only gave a strong motivation to the soldiers below, but also improved their morale. On the battlefield, the actions of a general could indeed lead the army to have a more positive effect. Relying on the protection of his heavy armor, he ignored the enemy's arrows and allowed them to land on his body, creating clanking sounds. Soon, he closed the distance of 200 meters. Then, he brandished his saber and killed the Tatar cavalrymen on their horses. Turn around, retreat while fighting. Su He, who already knew the strength of the mercenary cavalry, knew that if he directly went up to fight with them, it would be difficult for the 3,000 cavalrymen, including himself, to escape alive. The only thing he could do now was to retreat while fighting. Only then could he see more chances of survival. Su He kept retreating, and the 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen also fought and retreated with him. However, the drawbacks of doing this were also very big. If they didn't form a sufficient defensive line, they wouldn't be able to resist the attack of the mercenaries. In such a retreat, the losses of the Tatar cavalrymen were naturally great. After a few exchanges, about 500 cavalrymen's corpses were left behind. Retreat quickly, use the arrows to counterattack while retreating, knowing that if this continued, the 3,000 cavalrymen would be eaten sooner or later, Su He anxiously shouted. The Tatar cavalrymen were very obedient, or it could be said that they were very disciplined on the battlefield. After hearing Su He's words, they turned around and fled. While fleeing, they used the arrows from time to time to counterattack. In this way, the original cavalry charge evolved into a chase. At this moment, the archers on both sides displayed their ability to fight on horseback. Arrows flew back and forth, and it was very lively. Chapter 7:17. However, even if it was a clash of bows and arrows, there was still the matter of who was the main attacker and who was the auxiliary attacker. As the chase continued, it was clear that the mercenaries who were charging in from the front had an advantage. The Tatar cavalry who were constantly retreating had suffered losses, and the number of cavalry had been sharply decreasing. Fortunately, the sky was completely dark at this time. If it was daytime, the losses would be even greater. However, the night also had its disadvantages. As they continuously retreated, the formation of the Tatar cavalry was already extremely chaotic. Some of the cavalry had run off to who knows where, making it impossible for them to form an effective defensive formation. They were unable to form a dense net like the mercenaries once they launched an arrow attack. As they kept retreating and the formation was in chaos, the Tatar cavalry's counterattack with bows and arrows no longer had the ability to deter them. They could only passively take a beating. In the end, even General Su He himself separated from the main force with only a dozen soldiers. He still wanted to gather the scattered soldiers, but he didn't know where to find them. He sighed inwardly at his brother's good luck, and could only lead the dozen or so personal guards to chase in the direction of the main force. The 3,000 Tatar cavalry were defeated just like that. Apart from the initial threat of the arrows, they didn't put up any decent resistance. From start to finish, they only delayed Yang Chendong's troops for a little more than 2 hours. The main force of the mercenaries once again entered the process of chasing the enemy. During this time, the main force of the Tatar cavalry didn't run very far. This was because not long after they escaped from the southern forest under the leadership of Lord Agar Dorje, they encountered the Tiger's Man Independent Regiment and the Windchaser Regiment that were responsible for ambushing and blocking. The two regiments were ordered to guard the retreat of the Tatar cavalry. Just as they began to set up the battlefield and ambush, they saw many figures in the distance. The main force of the Tatar cavalry was rushing over. Attack! Tiger's Man didn't even have time to dig up the mines. He led his 3-gun brigades to launch a frontal assault on the retreating Tatar cavalry. The sudden gunshots, the dense gunshots without any warning, and the whistling of the flames that could be seen in the darkness instantly disrupted the formation of the retreating Tatar cavalry. After a series of gunshots, at least a few hundred riders died on their horses, and over 1,000 were injured to varying degrees. Seeing the firearm battalion of the mercenaries here, Agadorji, who was following the army, naturally turned pale with fright. What he was more worried about wasn't how much of an attack he had suffered. He was more worried about why there were so many mercenaries here. Shouldn't they have been pinned down by General Glenn's headquarters on the northern slope of the West River? Could it be that their appearance here meant that something had already happened on both sides? As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, Agar Dorji felt uneasy. When the Kiliarchs came to ask for instructions, he actually didn't have a definite idea. Speaking of which, Agar Dorji's military talent wasn't very good. It was only because he was born into a good family and had followed his elder brother Tuachuo Buhua since he was young that he gradually began to master the military. When it came to controlling people's hearts, he might have some methods, but when it came to commanding on the battlefield, his ability was far inferior. In his confusion, Agar Dorji, who didn't have much military talent to begin with, didn't have any better ideas. Faced with the instructions of his junior generals, he could only order the army to charge through the enemy's defensive line. Only in this way could they have a chance to escape. Without a strict organization, the Tatar cavalry charged in 1,000-men formation. However, facing Tiger's Man's 3 gun brigades, 7 cavalry brigades, and more than 2,000 cavalry from the Windchaser group, such a charge naturally caused heavy losses. The battle lasted for more than 2 hours. Apart from about 3,000 cavalry that managed to break through the encirclement, the rest of the Tatar cavalry were still trapped here, unable to escape. It was at this time that General Suhi rushed over with a dozen soldiers. Agar Dorji, who was at his wit's end, was overjoyed when he heard the news and wanted to hand over the command of the army to him. However, when the two met, General Suhi's head was already covered in cold sweat. The first sentence he said made Agar Dorji feel as if the heavens wanted to kill him. "Sir, behind me is the main force of the mercenaries. This time, with 2 sides surrounding us, I'm afraid that the army won't be able to escape destruction." So fast. Hearing that the main force of the mercenaries was coming from behind, Agar Dorji felt as if the world was spinning and he couldn't see any hope. In contrast, Suhi was much calmer. Although the current situation was very difficult, it wasn't that they didn't have any advantages. For example, their current total military strength was higher than the enemy's. For example, it was now night and they were better at escaping. Of course, even if they had more military strength than the enemy, Suhi wasn't arrogant enough to think that they could achieve a full counterattack and achieve victory. The continuous escape had caused the army to lose the most important morale. To put it more harshly, the morale of the army might collapse at any time. Once that happened, there was no doubt that they would lose. Although Agar Dorji had many faults, such as being greedy, cowardly, bullying the weak, and fearing the strong, in any case, this person was still his superior. If Agar didn't put him in an important position, he wouldn't be where he was today. At this moment, Suhi made up his mind to repay Agar Dorji. "Your Excellency, it is impossible to turn the tables now. You can only escape and hope that you can rise again to take revenge for what happened today," Suhi said as if she had made some kind of decision. When he made this decision, he was also prepared to sacrifice himself at any time. Agar Dorji was shocked by Suhi's decision. He was a little touched and asked, "If I leave, what about you, General?" "Me? Of course I'll stay and lead the army to fight the mercenaries. If I don't do that, I'm afraid that you won't be able to take the opportunity to escape." Suhi smiled bitterly. Who didn't want to live? But when he was destined to sacrifice others, he could only choose to stay. After all, the other party was Agar Dorji, and he was only a general under him. Agar Dorji, of course, knew this truth. At this moment, he was extremely excited and angry. He was excited because Suhi was willing to sacrifice him to protect himself. He was angry because this battle had cost them everything. From now on, he could no longer be a powerful force on the prairie. The glory of the past had nothing to do with him. Regardless of what he thought, Agar Dorji finally agreed to Suhi's request and chose to leave. At this time, He really handed over the command of the army to Su He. He only left 3,000 elite cavalrymen with him to break out of the encirclement. After Su He got the command, the first thing she did was to let the soldiers around her spread the news that General Gu Lang of the North Slope and Halarua of the West River were coming here. As long as they could hold on until dawn, the army would come to support them and turn the tide. Of course, this was impossible. According to Su He's judgment, it was very likely that the two armies had met with mishap. Otherwise, where would the mercenaries find the strength to intercept him here? But he still had to tell the public this. Only then would the morale of the army not be in chaos and not collapse, creating a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. Sure enough, Su He's strategy was correct. After the news was released, the originally chaotic Tatar cavalry calmed down a lot. People were afraid of having no hope. As long as there was hope, anyone would think of a way to fight for it. The morale of the army was temporarily stabilized. Su He commanded the army to form a defensive line to block the attacks of the mercenaries behind him. At the same time, he sent 2,000 cavalrymen to charge at the mercenaries blocking the road. He wanted to tear a hole in the front in the shortest time possible to create a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. With the morale of the army stabilized, the orders were carried out seriously by the cavalrymen below. When Yang Chendong brought the main army to the rear of the Tatar cavalry, it was not as easy as expected. Instead, it was met with strong resistance. What's going on? Yang Chendong saw that many of the mercenaries were too careless and rushed too quickly. As soon as they entered the defensive line of the Tatar cavalry, they were submerged. In a short period of time, they lost hundreds of cavalrymen. He ordered his men to stop the attack and called over the scouts to ask about the situation. The battalion commander of the reconnaissance battalion, Su Yunsheng, had already joined the army at this moment. When he was called over by Yang Chendong for questioning, he told him what he saw. Sixth young master, the Tatar cavalry was indeed in chaos before, but because of the arrival of Su He, the situation changed. I don't know why they stabilized the morale of the army and had the power to fight back. After all, the time it happened was too short. It was already very difficult for the reconnaissance battalion to obtain this information. Yang Chendong did not mean to blame the other party. Instead, he asked with interest, after Su He came back, the morale of the army stabilized? It seems that this person has some ability. Yes, we learned from some of the prisoners that the order to retreat was also given by this person. It seems that his insight on the battlefield is also good. Beta Persei added. Haha, then I am interested in this person. Yang Chendong laughed. Now is the time to use people. If the other party was really capable, then he did not mind recruiting him for his own use. It was just that the enemy had not been defeated yet. It was a bit too early to think about this. Like this, give the order. Don't rush to attack. When the army arrives, launch a fierce attack in units of battalions and companies. We need to advance in all directions. We can't do any individual breakthroughs. Also, the reconnaissance battalion must immediately figure out the situation and allow you to see the prisoners freely. Yang Chendong was not willing to fight a battle that he was not confident in. At least, he would not rashly launch a fierce attack before he figured out what was going on in the enemy camp. Chapter 7:18. Beta Persei and Su Yunsheng want to carry out the order. Soon, the mercenaries' attack changed from the previous random attacks to an organized advance. As a result, the Tatar cavalry fell into a situation where they were forced to retreat step by step. It was beyond Su He's expectation that the mercenaries behind him reacted so quickly. He guessed that there might be a general in the enemy's camp who knew more about tactics and was commanding them. But now, he was not concerned about this. He was more concerned about whether the 2,000 cavalrymen he sent would be able to open a bloody path for Lord Agar Dorji to escape. Under the command of death, the 2,000 Tatar cavalrymen launched a suicidal attack. They were not afraid of the bullets and mercenaries who were several times their number. They just lowered their heads and charged forward. This kind of desperate fighting style finally allowed them to tear open a hole, giving Lord Agar Dorji an escape route. The 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen, who were also carrying hope, left the group. In addition to the ones who fled before, there were already 6,000 to 7,000 Tatar cavalrymen who rushed out. The Tatar cavalry paid a price. Of the 2,000 cavalrymen sent out, apart from those who died in battle or were captured, none of them returned to the barracks. Phew! Suhi breathed a long sigh of relief. Her heart, which had been hanging high before, was relieved. Now that Agar Dorji had escaped, his only worry was gone. The next step was to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries. He would use his death to prove that the Tatar cavalry was not to be trifled with. At this time, nearly 2 hours had passed since Yang Chenong summoned Su Yunchen. In an hour, the sky would be bright. At this time, Battalion Commander Su finally learned from the captives that Su He was able to unify the troops and quickly reported it to the 6th young master. Oh, this Su He actually came up with such an idea. He really has some ability. After listening to Su Yunqing's story, Yang Chendong couldn't help but sigh. This Su He was really a capable person. Previously, he didn't know how the other party did it, so he could only win step by step. But now that he knew the method the other party used, he only needed to find a way to counter it. How about this? Pass down my orders. Everyone, stop attacking and wait for daybreak. Once the enemy attacks, the musketeers will be at the front and the archers will be at the back, suppressing them from breaking through. This was not the result that Yang Chendong wanted to see. Since that was the case, he would just surround them and not attack. What he wanted now was not to destroy them, but to conquer them. The mercenaries suddenly stopped their fierce attacks, and the front line became quiet. This scene caught Su He, who was in the midst of the final battle, off guard. When he heard that there were no more sounds of killing coming from outside, he didn't know why, but he had a bad feeling. General, could it be that they are preparing for a big attack? Some Kiliarchs who were also confused came to Su He and asked for instructions. Someone asked, General, it's almost dawn. When will our reinforcements arrive? That's right. The soldiers below are looking forward to it. After a night of fighting, everyone is tired and suffered heavy losses. The soldiers below are very nervous. Su He obviously couldn't say that there were no reinforcements at all. Otherwise, the army would lose their morale and be unable to fight. In order to stabilize the situation, he could only continue to make arrangements. It's not far from dawn. The reinforcements should be here soon. What we need to do now is to accumulate strength. Once the reinforcements arrive, we will attack from the inside and outside and completely defeat the mercenaries. Hearing Su He's certainty, the Kiliarchs below couldn't help but smile with joy. They immediately agreed that they would do their best to stabilize the morale of the army before leaving. Su He, who was left behind, was puzzled. Could it be that the mercenaries were really preparing to launch a big attack? If that was the case, he had already decided to lead the army to fight to the death. When the time came, even if he died in battle, he would be able to deal a huge blow to the mercenaries. He wouldn't have lived in vain. But what if the other party wasn't going to attack? What if they had other plans? What should he do then? He looked up at the sky, although it was still so dark. However, Su He knew that the sky would brighten in 2 hours. In other words, there wasn't much time left for him to fight. Su He knew that he was going to die. He wanted to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries and die on the battlefield with the dignity of a soldier. Unfortunately, the mercenaries didn't act according to his plan. They suddenly stopped attacking and just surrounded him from afar. This gave Su He a bad feeling in his heart. As the saying goes, what you are afraid of will come true. Just when Su He was wondering if the other party had figured out her plan, suddenly there was a shout from the front line. The voice that only belonged to the Han people came clearly at this moment. Brothers of the Tatar cavalry, you have been fooled. You won't have any reinforcements at all. No matter Hala Ruachu of the Shiha Regiment or Jelong of the North Slope Regiment, they have been defeated by our mercenaries. We even captured Hala Ruachu alive. Now, you are all alone. Surrender immediately. Otherwise, you will only die, and it won't be worth it. Tatar cavalry brothers, you have been fooled. We won't have any reinforcements, no matter. The shout came one after another. It was transmitted to the Tatar army through the simple loudspeakers. When the cavalrymen heard the news for the first time, they all looked at each other with ugly and angry expressions. Their faces were ugly because of the situation they were in. They were angry because they knew that they were fooled. For a moment, the camp was like a nest that exploded. No matter how hard the Kiliarchs tried, they couldn't suppress it anymore. Left with no choice, these Kiliarchs could only band together and come to Suhi to ask for an explanation. Suhi didn't panic like everyone thought. Instead, he rode on his horse calmly. Looking at the angry Kiliarchs, he lowered his head and admitted his mistake. "I'm sorry, everyone. I lied before. We might really have no reinforcements." "What? Really no reinforcements? If that's the case, what should we do next? Without reinforcements, we won't be a match for the mercenaries." "That's right. What should we do? General Su, please come up with a plan." The Kiliarchs all talked at once. Facing Suhi, who admitted everything, they suddenly realized that they weren't that angry. After all, he didn't take the opportunity to escape. Instead, he stayed here like everyone else. With this, they couldn't vent their anger. First, Suhi calmed the Kiliarchs down. Then, he talked about how to deal with the mercenaries. "Brothers, it's obvious that the mercenaries want to use psychological tactics to win without a fight. If that's the case, we'll all become their prisoners. We'll even live a life worse than death. Since that's the case, why don't we give it a try? Maybe we'll have a chance to survive. Even if I can't escape and die on the battlefield, I can die a happy death and be a hero." "General, you mean?" The Kiliarchs had already guessed what Suhi was going to do next. "I mean, let's give it a try and kill our way out. Let's leave it to fate." Suhi also knew that at this moment, he could only tell the truth. Only then would they have a chance to live. Breaking out of the encirclement wasn't an easy thing to do. Most people might even lose their lives here. But as Suhi said, if they didn't do this, they didn't have any better choice now. These Kiliarchs looked at each other and finally nodded helplessly. After getting the support of these Kiliarchs, Suhi immediately gave the order for the entire army to charge out under the cover of the moonlight. After the order was given, the Tatar cavalry who were still doubting whether they were tricked were speechless by General Suhi's sincerity. Although they were angry, they didn't want to be captives. They didn't even dare to imagine what life would be like as captives. They could only try their best and hope that the heavens would take care of them and let them live. Every single one of them held on to the hope that they could survive. One by one, they unsheathed their cavalry sabers. Taking advantage of the fact that the sky had yet to brighten, they charged out to kill. When the hundreds and thousands of Tatar cavalry charged out, their battle formation was quite large. The moment the earth shook, the Tiger's Man independent regiment guarding the outermost perimeter felt it. As the regiment commander, Tiger's Man immediately ordered the 3 battalions of musketeers to get ready. At the same time, he ordered the soldiers who were burying the mines to retreat and prepare for battle. Behind the independent regiment, the Windchaser division that reinforced the 1st Regiment of Cavalry also prepared their bows and arrows, ready to fire at any time when the enemy approached. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were charging towards them. They seemed to have understood their situation. If their first charge was fruitless, then it would be even more difficult for them to come up with a good result. This time, the number of cavalrymen charging towards them increased, and their speed was also very fast. Although it was night, the earth was shaking, giving people the feeling that thousands of men and horses were bravely charging through a single plank bridge. Because of this, many of the mercenaries' expressions became very cold. Some of the soldiers even had cold sweat coming out of their palms. Sensing the nervousness of the soldiers, Tiger Edge, who had always been by Yang Qindong's side and had developed the aura of a general, laughed out loud. "Everyone, don't panic. We are well prepared. The enemy won't be able to rush over." As if to prove his words, a deafening explosion suddenly rang out. Streaks of fire soared into the sky and dyed the originally dark night. It actually lit up the eyes of the soldiers, allowing them to clearly see everything that was happening in front of them. Chapter 719. In the end, the Tatar cavalry still managed to rush into the landmines, triggering lightning and fire, sending countless enemy cavalry into the sky. After the landmines exploded, the fragments flew into the bodies of many Tatar cavalrymen, making them look like hedgehogs, screaming and wailing in pain. Under this kind of attack, the Tatar cavalry that rushed quickly became the target of the attack. Some of the cavalry at the front didn't even have time to shout before they were swallowed up by the ruthless power of the landmines. The powerful landmines caused the Tatar cavalry to involuntarily stop in their tracks. Their faces were pale as they looked forward. Their hearts were filled with complex feelings, but they were unable to speak. Fire. With the help of the monstrous flames, Tiger's man noticed that many Tatar cavalry had stopped 500 meters in front of them. He made a prompt decision and gave the order to fire. He knew that at this time, if he gave the enemy a heavy blow, it would be the last straw. It would play an extremely important role in deterring the enemy. With a loud shout, the 3 battalions fired at the same time. Although in the darkness, the accuracy of these auxiliary soldiers was greatly reduced, but the number of Tatar cavalry was large enough. Coupled with the fact that they weren't prepared at all, a burst of gunshots rang out. Who knew how many Tatar cavalry fell from their horses? First, the landmines sent people into the sky, then the firearms easily took people's lives. Under this kind of pressure, the Tatar cavalry had no choice but to retreat one by one. Originally, it seemed that the first attack with great momentum was fruitless. On the contrary, it was a big blow to their morale. After the failure of the assault, when most of the cavalry returned, many of them had a pessimistic expression on their faces. Many of them were already scared. In this kind of situation where they couldn't even see how many enemies there were and where they were, many of their brothers had died. This kind of fighting style really made them unable to see any hope of victory. After Suhi learned about the situation at the front line, he couldn't say a word for a long time. He knew that the situation might be worse than he imagined. If they couldn't rush out, then wouldn't it mean that they could only choose to surrender? The battlefield once again fell into silence. The mercenaries' voices came again. It was still the same words as before, but compared to before, this time some people began to be moved. The curses were also much less than before. The persuasion continued, and the sky finally began to brighten. After their vision returned to normal, the Tatar cavalry only felt more despair. In this kind of situation where their every move was clearly seen by the enemy, it would naturally be much more difficult for them to escape. At dawn, the persuasion continued, but the mercenaries didn't take a step forward. They also didn't rely on the advantage of the firearms in their hands to attack. Instead, they began to cook. Smoke spirals, and not long after, the aroma of meat. Young master, our logistics camp chefs are all here. They are still using the condiments produced in Crimson City, along with the freshly slaughtered meat. It will definitely be fragrant. Yang Er walked in front of Yang Chendong as if he was presenting a treasure, looking for praise. Very good. Yang Chendong nodded with satisfaction. While looking at the Tatar cavalry camp, he said, food is the most important thing to the people. The temptation of food can often achieve the goal of invincibility. Yang Chendong's guess was right. Using food to lure the enemy had proven to be very useful. In the past, the mercenaries had often used this trick to destroy the enemy's morale. This time, it was also successful. Yesterday afternoon, before the sky turned dark, they had eaten dinner. Now, it had been nearly 12 hours. During their escape, because the mercenaries were chasing closely behind them, some of the pots and bowls of food they brought along were thrown away halfway. They thought that they could kill their way out before dawn, so no one was worried about this matter. But now, after dawn, many of the cavalry's stomachs began to growl. Although many of them had a certain amount of dry food on them, it was absolutely not a problem for them to survive for at least 2 or 3 days. But the problem was that that was cold food. How could it be compared to hot food that was overflowing with the aroma of meat? After using the MSG and other things produced by Chicken City, the taste was particularly delicious. Saying that the aroma would spread for 10 miles might be an exaggeration, but with the morning breeze, it would not be a problem for it to spread for 2 to 3 miles on the open ground. When the aroma spread to the Tatar cavalry camp, many of the cavalry's expressions became somewhat abnormal. Especially those who were preparing to take out their dry food, their expressions became even more unsightly. Comparing people to people would lead to death, and comparing goods would lead to throwing away. Compared to the aroma of the fresh meat, the cold dry food was too tasteless. At this time, the voice urging them to surrender sounded again. Among them, there were some words about food. For example, The mercenaries promised that as long as they surrendered, they would immediately be able to eat fresh meat. At that time, they would be able to eat hot flatbread and drink meat soup. It would definitely be a delicacy. The picture outlined made many of the cavalry unable to help but make a swallowing motion. Then, the soldiers looked at each other, as if they were somewhat tempted. Hello, everyone. My name is Hulu, an authentic Mongolian. In a battle, I became a captive of the mercenaries. I originally thought that my life would be worse than death. But who would have thought that not only would I be able to live a better life and receive more money every month, I would also become a commander of 1,000 soldiers. The reason why I am telling you all this is to tell you that the reason why we gave up our homes and fought with our blood and flesh is because we want to live a better life. Right now, the opportunity is in front of you. As long as everyone surrenders to the mercenaries like me, as long as you have the ability, you do not have to worry about not being valued. This is the most realistic experience of a surrendered commander of 1,000 soldiers. Hello, everyone. My name is Taimur, a Nuzan cavalry. It was also in a battle that I became a captive of the mercenaries. Similarly, I am now a commander of a battalion. Now, I can save up a lot of money every month. Not only is my food better than before, my clothes are also better than before. Once this war is over, I can find a beautiful girl from the grassland and start a family. Then, I will have a bunch of children and live a life where I will not have to worry about food and drink. Haha. Hello, everyone. My name is Lu Dai, and I am also a Nuzan. I am also a captive. Previously, I was a deputy Qianhu in Biming's new Urgon-Dusi region. Now that I am a deputy commander, my treatment is more than 10 times better than before. Come quickly. There is delicious food that can strengthen our bodies. There are even sharper and more durable cavalry swords. There are also more high positions waiting for you. As long as everyone is willing to work hard, your future is limitless. Hello, everyone. My name is Yila, and I was originally a Qianhu in Biming's new Urgon-Dusi region. Now, I am a commander of the Nuzan cavalry. After coming to the mercenaries, the most authentic experience I have had is that they have the best military treatment in the world. They have the strongest weapons in the world. They also have the most generous rewards in the world. As long as you are here, as long as you can mount a horse and kill the enemy, as long as you are sincere enough, this place will become the paradise you have always dreamed of. Come, we welcome you. One by one, the officers stepped forward to share their experiences. They expressed their views on the mercenaries and their own experiences from different perspectives. They did not speak of any great principles, but the more simple their words were, the more they could gain the approval of the ordinary cavalry. They could resonate with them. As the voices of these officers reached the Tatar camp, the expressions of many of the cavalry changed. They were eager to move. It was as if they were only missing an opportunity to stand up and choose to surrender. The Kiliarchs who were in charge of them naturally felt this change. They all anxiously went to General Su He, hoping that he could think of a solution that would satisfy both sides. However, Su He did not say anything. He only looked at the sky helplessly and shook his head. Everyone had the right to choose their own way of life and their own future. He could not interfere. In fact, he could not interfere either. Otherwise, if he forcefully suppressed them, it would cause a mutiny. On the contrary, if these soldiers could have a good way out, he would be happy. Forget it. Since that is the case, let's send some of the injured soldiers to them first. It is also good to see if these mercenaries are true to their words. If they are, you can choose to surrender in order to live a better life. If not, then we'll fight them to the death. At worst, we'll just die. Hearing Su He's words, all the Kiliarchs were speechless. However, they could not refute it. Could they say that the general was wrong? Could it be that it was wrong for a general to find a way out for his soldiers? No one objected, and they could not object. After the order was passed down, some of the wounded Tatar cavalry became the first batch of captives to be sent to the mercenaries. Then everyone watched helplessly as the mercenaries dispatched a lot of troops. They used a stretcher to carry the Tatar cavalry away from the battlefield. At this moment, some people were envious of the injured soldiers. It seemed that only the wounded could openly defect to the enemy without being blamed by anyone. There were still calls to surrender from time to time, but as time passed, No one knew if the Tatar cavalry had become numb or if there were orders from above. In short, no one saw any uninjured cavalry choose to surrender. Chapter 720. Time passed little by little. When it was noon, the smell of meat came from afar. Along with it came another trump card. Some of the injured Tatar cavalrymen were sent back to the center of the battlefield. Brothers, I'm Gushan. I'm sure many of you know me. I was injured by an arrow and couldn't ride a horse, so I was sent to the mercenaries as a captive. A Tatar cavalryman on a horse shouted. Such a shout quickly caused a burst of discussion in the Tatar camp. That person is indeed Gushan. His hometown is not far from mine, so I know him. He is Gushan. He was originally with me. Even if he turned into ashes, I would still recognize him. I just didn't expect that when we left this morning, he couldn't get on a horse, but now he can ride a horse. Immediately, several Tatar cavalrymen took the initiative to testify, proving Gushan's true identity. After his identity was confirmed, Gushan's words were more credible. When he talked about his experience, everyone naturally chose to listen carefully. After listening to his story, they also knew what happened to him in the mercenaries. In Gushan's own words, although he was a captive, he was different from a captive. Since he and his injured companions came to the mercenaries, they were immediately surrounded by a group of medical officers called military doctors. Then, all kinds of examinations, all kinds of treatment, all kinds of medicine, and all kinds of methods were used. After the treatment, hot meat soup and flatbread were served in front of him. The people who surrounded him were also Mongolian men. Through the conversation, he knew that the Mongolian soldiers in front of him were not fake. Through the conversation, he gained a deeper understanding of the mercenary army system, and he also gained a deeper understanding of how the soldiers were treated. Gushan was a person who could speak. After he saw that many people were listening to him carefully, he bluntly announced that the treatment of soldiers was soldiers was 10 taels of silver a month, soldiers were 15 taels of silver a month. The so-called B soldiers were the second-line troops with weaker fighting ability. These soldiers were naturally the first-line troops with tyrannical strength. When this treatment was announced, it immediately attracted the attention of the Tatar cavalrymen who were listening carefully. The Tatar cavalrymen were only paid 2 taels of silver a month. Of course, if there was a war, there would still be some extra benefits. For example, they could keep a portion of the things they looted. The military merits they obtained could also be exchanged for a portion of silver taels. But even so, on average, the amount of silver they received each month was still limited. It was far from being as generous as the salary of the mercenaries. Not to mention, according to what Gushan had heard, once the mercenaries were involved in a war, their rewards would only be greater. For example, if you killed an enemy on the battlefield, you could get a reward of 1 to 10 taels of silver. This also depended on who you killed. Hearing this, the Tatar cavalrymen's eyes revealed excitement and even yearning. The cavalry here were all Tatar elites. In terms of combat ability, they were more powerful than the Tatar cavalry at the West River and the North Slope. All capable people were conceded. Things like military exploits were as easy as eating a meal in their hands. Who wouldn't be tempted when they heard that they could receive so many rewards for their military service? The so-called capable people needed a platform to display their abilities, and the mercenary group was obviously a very good platform to display their abilities. It made the hearts of the capable people yearn for it. Speaking of the treatment of the Mongol cavalrymen, although their ability to march and fight was very strong, due to the constraints of the environment, they did not seem to have much creativity other than fighting and hurting. Because of this, their treatment had always been very poor. It was even worse than the Ming army, the original Nuzen tribe, and the Mongol tribe in Narcissus town. The price they paid was not proportional to the benefits they received. This made many of the Tatar cavalrymen resentful. But when they thought about how everyone was like this on the Mongolian grassland, they slowly balanced out. But balance did not mean that they had truly accepted it. They still wanted to prove themselves and improve their treatment. After all, with money, they could do many things. This was something that everyone knew. Why did the Mongol cavalrymen always like to plunder? It would not take long for them to think of attacking the Central Plains. Wasn't it because they were too poor? Everyone knew that the Central Plains was vast with abundant resources. The people there were also very rich. If they did not target them, who else would they target? Although many people would die in every war, compared to the benefits, the risk was worth it. But now, they did not need to go out of the grassland to plunder others. They could also receive good treatment. This was equivalent to having benefits in front of them. How many people would not be tempted? How many people would be able to ignore it? At this time, it was not only the ordinary Tatar cavalrymen. Some of the Tatar centurions and kiliarchs were also tempted. Gushan had just said that an ordinary soldier's monthly salary was at least 10 taels of silver. As a small general, they would receive even more. If they followed this treatment and worked in the mercenary army for a few years, wouldn't they have enough money to marry a wife, build a house, and buy sheep and horses? If they really had money and a happy and comfortable life, who would want to go to war and take risks? Gushan's appearance made many people have a better understanding of the mercenary army and yearn for it. In the following time, more Tatar cavalrymen like Gushan who had been treated with minor injuries were released. They came to the center of the two armies and began to help spread the benefits of the mercenary army. One person's words might not be credible, but what about 10 people, 100 people, or more? Not to mention that the original words were true. With so many people saying the same thing, even if it was false, it would become true. As more and more of their original companions came forward to speak, gradually, no one doubted the truth of the matter. On the contrary, everyone's eyes were full of stars, imagining the various benefits after joining the mercenary army. Gushan and the others were sent out because they had received a certain promise from the mercenary army. For example, the so-called mercenary logistics battalion commander Beta Persei, who was in charge of receiving them, said that as long as they helped persuade the Tatar cavalrymen, once they chose to surrender, not only would they receive a reward of 100 taels of silver for their military service, but after their injuries were healed, their ability would be tested first and they would be able to enter the corps. Even if it was for themselves, Gushan and the others would go all out and do their best to praise the mercenary army to the best of their ability. Their efforts finally paid off. Under the extreme temptation of words, finally a bold Tatar cavalryman walked out of the camp and came to the center of the two armies, expressing his willingness to surrender to the mercenary army. His appearance was naturally welcomed by Gushan and the others. In the warm applause, the mercenary army also sent out 2 battalions of soldiers to welcome him. Immediately, a special person came forward to register. The officer in charge of the reception also praised the Tatar cavalryman for daring to be the first to come forward. He said that if this person performed well, he would be given more consideration for his promotion. With such a living example in front of them, the other Tatar cavalrymen finally couldn't help but take the initiative to stand out. They scrambled to be the first, as if they were afraid that all the benefits would be taken away by others if they were late. More and more Tatar cavalrymen chose to surrender. They put down their weapons, jumped off their horses, and joined the mercenary army. Because of this, the tension of the previous war slowly disappeared. So much so that the originally tense string was also relaxed. There were also examples of centurions and kiliarchs joining the mercenary army. In the main camp of the Tatar cavalry, Suhi stood at the entrance of the large tent. He looked at everything that was happening in front of him from afar and was speechless for a long time. There was no expression on his face. He couldn't tell if he was happy or disappointed. Suhi's mood was indeed a bit complicated. You could say that he was happy. So many of his brothers had a way to live, so he was naturally happy. But at the same time, he was worried that the mercenary army would not treat his brothers well. Since they had surrendered, it was the same as fish on the chopping board, waiting to be slaughtered. If all of this was fake, then what should he do? Under such a worried mood, Gushan, who had done his best to talk, crossed the line between the two armies and arrived in front of Suhi. This was deliberately requested by Suhi. He wanted to contact Gushan alone and use his experience to judge whether what Gushan said was true or false. Seeing that Gushan had arrived, he calmly turned around and walked into the large tent. He spat out a sentence, "Come with me." Gushan was naturally cautious and even a little nervous. After all, he was just an ordinary Tatar cavalryman. It was impossible for him to meet a general like Suhi who commanded tens of thousands of troops. But now, they could actually meet alone. It was imaginable how his mentality had changed. As soon as he entered the tent, it was incomparably cold. Suhi turned his head and said casually, "Sit anywhere?" "Thank you, General. I'm used to standing." Gu Shan was still very aware of his identity. He didn't sit down but stood respectfully at the side. Suhi saw Gu Shan's performance, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he sat down and asked casually, "Tell me everything you saw after going to the mercenary camp and the benefits they promised you. Remember, don't lie. If I find out, you'll never be able to walk out of this tent." There wasn't the slightest anger in his voice, and there wasn't even the slightest murderous intent. However, these words brought a lot of pressure to Gu Shan, so much so that he suddenly broke out in cold sweat. It also gave him a feeling that it was best not to lie in front of General Su He. Otherwise, he would definitely lose his life here. Chapter 721. "Yes, General, I will report truthfully," Gu Shan said very sincerely. Then he recounted everything that happened when he entered the mercenary camp in detail. He even told Beta Persei about the things that he promised him. "General, I didn't say a single lie. Everything I said is true. I also saw our mercenary Tatar soldiers in the previous battle in the barracks. Most of them were treated well. Although they were locked in military tents, they were not beaten, scolded, or reprimanded. They even had a fixed time to come out every day. And once some of them were willing to surrender, they would immediately be separated and receive better treatment. Even those soldiers who did not make a choice for the time being would be able to eat their fill for 3 meals and would not go hungry." Suhi nodded from time to time as he listened carefully to Gu Shan's detailed account of everything he saw. He could feel that Gu Shan was not lying. He had interrupted several times and then asked the previous questions again. The answers he got were the same. There was no difference. He learned more about the mercenary army from Gu Shan's mouth. He also knew that his soldiers were doing well. He could finally rest assured. He slowly closed his eyes, then waved his hand and said, "Very good. Thank you for telling me so much. You can leave now." Gu Shan, who could leave, did not immediately move. Instead, he took the initiative to say after struggling in his heart, "General, don't you choose to join the mercenary army? They are indeed treated well, and their mental outlook is not worse than our Tatar cavalry." "Hee, don't say any more. Otherwise, you will only force me to change my mind about not killing you. You can leave now." Although he did not say anything more, Suhi had already expressed his determination with practical actions. That is, others can surrender, but he will not. No matter what, he was a general who once commanded tens of thousands of cavalry. How could he choose to surrender in exchange for a new life? At this point, Suhi was about to get angry. By right, this should be the time for Gu Shan to leave. However, he still didn't move. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, he suddenly said, "General, the mercenaries hope to see you join them. They even promised you the opportunity to lead an army alone after you join them. He also said that if you don't go, young Master Haraluo's life will be in danger." Listening to Gu Shan's noisy words, Suhi was about to get angry. Was his expression not clear and specific enough? Why was the other party still trying to persuade him? He had to show the other party some power. Just as he was about to punish Gu Shan, he suddenly heard the last sentence. When he heard Hararuo's name, his originally closed eyes suddenly opened. "What did you say? If Harak is still alive, how is he now?" Suhi finally reacted, which made Gu Shan breathe a sigh of relief. Before coming, Beta Persei told him that if possible, he could help persuade Su He. For this, he even wrote him a letter. But Beta Persei also said that this mission could be abandoned. After all, it was too dangerous. No one would blame him if he didn't complete it. Of course, if he completed it well, there would be additional rewards and so on. On the way to see Su He, Gu Shan thought a lot. In the end, he decided to give it a try. This was not only because of the generous rewards, but also because of a more important reason. He respected General Su He very much and didn't want to see the general die because he didn't surrender. So he finally mustered up the courage to give it a try. Now, it seems that he finally made the right bet. Gu Shan happily took out the letter from his arms and handed it to Su He. "General, this is a letter from the mercenary general. There should be the answer you want in it. Take a look." Suhi didn't hesitate to take the letter, then opened it and read it. He finally knew what happened at Shiha and the North Slope. It was as he expected and guessed. Whether it was the 5,000 Tatar cavalry at Shiha or the 10,000 Tatar cavalry at the North Slope, they were all defeated. The defeat was very thorough. General Gulang, who was in charge of the North Slope, was killed in the chaos. Harak, who led the 5,000 Shiha cavalry, was lucky and was captured alive. Now he was in the hands of the mercenaries, who originally wanted to kill him. But if Suhi was willing to surrender, this person would not die. This was the promise of the mercenary leader, the great Ming dynasty's loyalty and courage. It also expressed the other party's importance to him. At the end of the letter, there was also Yang Qindong's handwriting. General Suhi, I have long heard of your ability to command troops. I look forward to it. If you are willing to return, you will be put in an important position. The great Ming dynasty's loyalty and courage is a great promise. Just this line of words, in Suhi's eyes, was as heavy as 10,000 kilograms. It made Suhi feel touched. The fact that the other party was trying so hard to subdue him made him feel a little happy in his heart. A good bird chooses a good tree to nest in. Any capable person would want to find a wise master. Only in this way would they not bury their talents. Suhi also had a great dream in his heart. That was to rule the entire grassland like his predecessor, the greatest hero in his heart, Genghis Khan. Then, he would let the Mongolian cavalry conquer the world and achieve supreme hegemony. Unfortunately, this dream was completely lost because he followed Agadorji. This was a greedy person, a short-sighted person. As long as he could eat his fill, wear warm clothes, and have enough power, he would stop moving forward. If he followed such a person, he might be able to barely survive, but it was obviously impossible to achieve great things. If the other party did not promote him and put him in an important position, Suhi would have left long ago. He originally thought that he would not have the chance to fulfill his wish in this life. But now, the opportunity was in front of him again. The Duke of Loyalty and Courage, the legendary war god, who could easily defeat Yesin, had extended an olive branch to him. How could he not be excited? But sometimes, being excited was not enough. What really moved Suhi was that as long as he chose to surrender, he could save Horror Ruashian's life. This hit his heart, making him enter into a situation where he had no choice. Without Agadorji's attention and promotion, Suhi would not be where he was today. In order to repay the favor, he risked his life to let the other party leave. Logically speaking, he had already repaid the favor. But this didn't seem to be enough. He didn't just want to call it even. He also wanted the other party to owe him a favor. This way, no matter who talked about this matter in the future, they wouldn't blame him anymore. And if he could save Horror Ruashian, it would be equivalent to making Agadorji owe him a big favor. That would be perfect. Is Horror Ruashian still alive? I want to see him before making a decision. Although Suhi was already moved, he did not show it. Instead, he said very calmly, "Yes, I will pass on the general's request to the mercenary general. You just have to wait for the news." Gushan naturally could not make any promises. He also did not have the authority to do so. All he could do was to pass on the original words. "Okay, I will give us 2 days. If we still do not see Horror Ruashian in 2 days, then you are deceiving me. At that time, even if I have to risk my life, I will fight you to the end." Suhi's voice became cold, releasing a murderous aura.
Yes.
Gushan was affected. After hurriedly agreeing, he left the tent. Not long after, this news was passed back to the mercenary camp. Regarding Suhi's request, the officers below had different opinions. Someone suggested that Horror Ruashian could not be handed over. This person had previously had unfavorable thoughts towards the 6th young master and even fought a big battle at the short stone pile. He was also Agadorji's only son. This person could not be let go and should be killed. Moreover, the other party was not surrounded. The news said that at least 6,000 Tatar cavalry had escaped. It was hard to guarantee that they would not become a threat in the future. As soon as this idea was put forward, it received a lot of support. Everyone thought that it was not worth it to let go of Horror Ruachu for the sake of Suhi, a loser. With so many people supporting this idea, the voices of quarreling in the tent quickly disappeared. After reaching a consensus, everyone's eyes fell on young Chandong, who had been sitting at the head of the tent without speaking. 1,000 soldiers are easy to obtain, but a general is difficult to find. You must have all heard of it. With a smile on his face, Yang Chandong's eyes swept across the faces of the officers in the tent. Suhi's ability is obvious to all of you. Let me ask everyone a question. In front of the mercenaries, if you were to command the Tatar cavalry, can you guarantee that you would do better than Suhi? Yang Chandong didn't go to talk about any great principles. Instead, he used facts to speak. Just a question was thrown out, and the tent immediately became silent. They asked themselves, unless they knew all of the sixth young master's plans, and if they worked together, they might have a chance of winning. Otherwise, they would not be able to win this battle. It could be said that the moment the Tatar cavalry became enemies with the mercenaries, they had already lost. Haha, I know that many of you look down on the general of a defeated army. But what I want to say is that defeat is not the fault of the general. Whoever commands this army will have the same result. So why should you look down on Suhi? As for defeats, most of you have experienced them before, right? When have I ever looked at you in a different light? When this question was asked, many of the faces in the tent became red. This was especially true for Yella and Lu Dai, who were the commander of the Jurchen cavalry division. Their faces were flushed red. Weren't they the general of a defeated army? It was because of their ability that they were chosen by Yang Chandong and placed in an important position. Chapter 722. Even if he was such a person, what qualifications did he have to look down on others? Everyone stopped talking. Yang Chandong smiled and said, "As for Haraluo, a dead person has no value. If we can use a person who is already dead in our eyes in exchange for Suhi's sincere surrender, it is worth it. Don't you think so?" This time, no one said anything. This was not only because Yang Chandong's prestige was too high, to the point that his words carried enormous weight. More importantly, what he said was indeed very reasonable, making it difficult for everyone to find a place to refute. Because Yang Chandong expressed his opinion, the matter was settled. He immediately let the scouts return to the first city and bring Haraluo to the battlefield. Yang Chandong also made the decision to go to the Tatar cavalry army to see Suhi personally. Naturally, some people showed concerns about this decision, but Yang Chandong said that he had confidence in the Black Knights. In addition, the mercenaries could press to the front line. Once they found that the situation was not right, they could immediately launch a general attack. Finally, the other officers could not say anything. The scout left quickly and returned quickly as well. After only a day and a half, Haraluo was brought in front of Yang Chandong. Compared to the last time they met, this person was slightly embarrassed. It should be because he had not washed his face for a few days. He gave people the feeling that he was very listless. Come, fetch water for him to wash his face and get him a set of clean clothes to change into. Yang Chandong just casually glanced at Haraluo, then looked away. If such a small person was not still useful now, perhaps he would not take a second look at him in his life. Haraluo was taken away. When he followed Yang Chandong and the 100 or so black-clad knights out of the mercenary camp, it was as if he had changed into a different person. He was much more energetic. Although his appearance had recovered a lot, it could still be seen from his constantly moving eyes that he was still very afraid at this moment. After becoming a captive, he no longer knew what his future path was. He didn't even know when he would die. Under this shadow, he didn't dare to say anything. Once he noticed that the surrounding black-clad soldiers were looking at him, he tried his best to put on a flattering smile to curry favor. To Haraluo's horror, he was surprised to find that after leaving the mercenary camp, they were actually heading towards the Tatar army. He carefully looked at the black knights beside him. There were only a little more than 100 of them. He really couldn't understand. Would such a small number of people really dare to bring him to the Tatar cavalry's camp? Could this be the so-called boldness of the skilled? While thinking, Yang Chandong led more than 100 black knights through the ceasefire battlefield, heading straight for the Tatar camp. Along the way, they saw many Tatar cavalry who were hesitating whether to surrender or not. When they saw Yang Chandong and the 100 black knights, their eyes were also filled with shock and confusion. In front of the largest tent in the Tatar cavalry's camp, Suhi stood to welcome them. When he saw the Black Knights coming from afar and Hilario in the group, his face didn't change, but his heart was really shocked. The mercenaries really did send Hilario over. They really kept their word. Everyone, since you are here, why don't you take a seat in the main tent? In the spirit of hospitality, and also wanting to test the other party, Suhi made an invitation. Of course, he also wanted to test them. He wanted to see if the mercenaries were really so bold, and if they had the courage to do so. Of course. The one who answered him was Yang Qindong, riding the white dragon horse at the head of the group. Along the way, he didn't panic, as if he was walking in his own camp. He didn't show the slightest sign of weakness. On the contrary, when he came in front of Suhi, his eyes were still constantly looking at this person, as if he was looking at a treasure. Yang Qindong, who agreed, dismounted from his horse and led Beta Persei and Xiuvi, as well as Ba Daojiang and Peng Yu, who were escorting Hilario, and strode into the tent. As soon as they entered the tent, they could see that both sides of the tent were filled with executioners holding swords and sabers. There were about 50 of them. They were glaring angrily at Yang Qindong and the others who came in. It was as if they would chop the intruders into minced meat at the slightest command. You are cheating, how dare you? After Beta Persei and Xiuvi saw the situation in front of them, they stood on the left and right respectively and pulled out their sabers. Their eyes were filled with anger and killing intent. On the other hand, Yang Qindong wasn't confused by the scene in front of him. Instead, he smiled and looked at Suhi, who had already walked to the front and was 3 meters away from him. He asked, "Is this how you treat your guests?" At this time, Yang Qindong not only showed that he wasn't afraid, but in fact, he really wasn't. Hilario was still in his hands and hadn't been handed over to the other party yet. Just based on this, the other party didn't dare to act rashly. According to his analysis, the reason why they put on such a posture was just to scare him. While Yang Qindong was speaking, Daojiang and Peng Yu also tightened their grip on the sabers in their hands. The sabers were placed on Hilario's neck. It seemed that this movement would draw blood, causing Hilario to cry out in alarm. Suhi, don't act rashly, don't act rashly. Instead of scaring the others, Suhi scared his own people. There was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. Then he waved his hand, and the 50 axemen took a step back in unison, maintaining a safe distance from Yang Qindong and the others. After expressing a certain amount of goodwill, Suhi looked at Yang Qindong and asked, "Can you let them go now?" Logically speaking, the danger wasn't over yet. Letting them go now was equivalent to putting themselves in danger. If it was anyone else, they wouldn't agree so easily. However, Yang Qindong wasn't an ordinary person. 50 axemen wasn't a small number, but it wasn't a big deal in his eyes. The 4 men he brought with him could each fight against 10 men, and his own strength was unfathomable. Outside the tent, Dao Xiao was leading more than 100 Black Knights. It was impossible for them to fend off an army of 10,000, but it would not be a problem for them to fend them off for a while. Once chaos broke out here, the mercenaries outside would charge in. These were the reasons why he was so confident. Because of this, after hearing Suhi's question, Yang Qindong smiled. "Of course we can let them go. I originally wanted to give them to you. Come, let young Master Hilario go." Daojiang and Peng Yu were stunned for a moment. However, this was the 6th young master's order. Although the 2 of them were reluctant, they still put down their sabers and pushed Hilario to Suhi's side. This action also gave Suhi a fright. What he said just now was just to test the waters. If the other party didn't let him go, he would definitely mock them and point out that the mercenaries were also as timid as mice. He could use this opportunity to suppress the other party's momentum. But now, the other party really let them go. Just this magnanimity and boldness made him speechless. Suhi didn't know what to say. Hilario, who was released, finally regained his freedom. He suddenly shouted, "General Su, quickly capture these people. Their status isn't low. We can threaten them to make the mercenaries pay the price." Along the way, although he didn't know Yang Qindong's true identity, he had met him twice. In addition, when he left the mercenaries' camp, he could see that many people looked at Yang Qindong with very respectful gazes. Just based on this, he guessed that this person's status wasn't ordinary. Thus, he shouted loudly. At this moment, Hilario's style of being an ingrate was incisively and vividly displayed. These words also made the surrounding 50 executioners move. Just now, the other party had hostages in their hands, so they didn't dare to act rashly. But now, the enemy had nothing, so they didn't put him in their eyes. Hilario's shout also made Beta Persei, Chiovi, and the other two become very nervous. The four of them even involuntarily touched their waists. They all came with pistols. If the situation goes out of control, they will pull out their guns and kill. However, Yang Chendong still didn't panic. Instead, he looked at Su He and smiled, as if to tell everyone that he was not an enemy, but a friend. Su He was also one of the calmer people. At least he didn't shout, nor did he have the intention to order the arrest. Instead, he looked at Yang Chendong, his eyes full of curiosity. "But I don't know who you are?" Seeing Yang Chendong's calmness, and also seeing that this person was the leader of the Black Knights, Su He was indeed interested. This person's boldness and courage were something he had never seen in his life. With this alone, this person was worthy of respect. "What? General Su, you really don't know who I am? Well, I will tell you. Listen carefully. I am the great Ming's loyal duke, the one you call the war god." With a smile still on his face, Yang Chendong revealed his identity word by word. Loyal duke? War god. The moment the name was said, not only Su He, but also the 50 executioners involuntarily took a step back, their faces showing a look of horror. What was the meaning of a person's name, the shadow of a tree, was perfectly interpreted at this time. After a brief panic, everyone carefully looked at Yang Chendong. After all, it wasn't the first time they heard the name of the war god, but it was rumored that this person had 3 heads and 6 arms and was 3 feet tall. But now, looking at him, he was the same as them, but younger and more handsome. You are the war god?" Su He asked in disbelief. "It's true. And when you go to the mercenary army in the future, you will naturally know that I am not lying," Yang Chendong said with a smile, almost patting his chest and taking out his ID card as proof. "You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.